The hearing will come to order. Good morning and welcome to the Budget Committee's hearing on Poverty in America, Economic Realities of Struggling Families. I want to welcome our witnesses here with us today. This morning we will be hearing from several leaders from the Poor People's Campaign, Reverend Dr. William J Barber II, Reverend Dr. Liz Theo Harris, Ms. Callie Greer, Ms. Kenya Alqass, Mr. Christopher Overfelt, and Ms. Savannah Kenzie. We are also pleased to have Pastor Latasha Fields from the Christian Home Educators Support System and Pastor David Mahan from Frontline Youth Communications. And we are also honored to have Speaker Nancy Pelosi with us this morning. And I ask unanimous consent that the Speaker be permitted to sit at the dais and participate in today's hearing. Without objection, so ordered. It also is possible that we will have votes during this hearing. I ask unanimous consent that the chair be authorized to declare a recess at any time. Without objection, so ordered. I will now yield myself 5 minutes for my opening statement. Again, the hearing has come to order. Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us. I'd like to welcome once again our panel of witnesses. We appreciate you coming here to help us engage in a meaningful discussion on the character of our country and the ongoing struggle with poverty and economic injustices faced by far too many Americans. I would also like to thank Congresswoman Barbara Lee for her leadership on this issue and her work to bring attention to this ongoing crisis through the Poverty Task Force. The statistics on poverty are jarring. As of 2017, according to the Census, nearly 40 million people, or more than 1 in 10 Americans, lives in poverty. But that number, as I know our witnesses will testify to, fails to account for the tens of millions of more Americans who still struggle to make ends meet. At the same time, 90% of households account for less than 23% of the nation's income. This past Sunday marked the longest period of time in U.S. history without an increase in the federal minimum wage. And overall wage growth, after adjusting for inflation, has remained nearly stagnant for 40 years. Meanwhile, housing prices have gone up dramatically in many areas of the country, tuition costs have skyrocketed, and Americans are paying more for nearly every expense. These facts are important, but they tell only part of the story. The purpose of this hearing is to shine a light on the challenges that Americans face in meeting their basic human needs. We will hear from people who experience these challenges firsthand and whose lives are directly impacted by the decisions and policies made in Washington. That's not to say that the federal government isn't already playing an important role in the lives of American families working their way up the economic ladder. Critical investments in federal programs have kept millions of Americans above the poverty line and have cut the poverty rate nearly in half over the last 50 years. Medicaid and CHIP provide health coverage to 73 million Americans, including more than 1 in 3 children. To date, 33 states and the District of Columbia have expanded their Medicaid programs to low-income working-age adults, helping to bring the nation's uninsured rate to a record low. The Supplemental Nutritional Assistance Program, or SNAP, provides nutrition assistance to nearly 43 million Americans each month, including 1.4 million veterans. Child Care and Development Block Grants supported nearly 800,000 families, ensuring children were cared for while parents worked to put food on the table. The Earned Income Tax Credit has lifted millions of workers out of poverty instead of being taxed into it. And in 2017, more than 5 million households received assistance with heating and cooling costs through the Low-Income Home Energy Assistance Program, helping families stay safe and healthy. But we need to be doing far more, not less. For decades, efforts in Washington to close the gap between ongoing efforts to fight poverty and what is needed to fully address this crisis have been inadequate. But now these programs and the millions they serve are under constant attack. Rather than increasing investments in evidence-based programs that help more struggling Americans get ahead, the administration is proposing to change the way they measure the poverty rate in a backdoor attempt to cut off vital aid to potentially millions of Americans. There have also been consistent attempts by states to impose so-called work requirements on Medicaid recipients that only serve to deny health care to people. The governor of my home state, by his own admission, said his Medicaid waiver request will take potentially life-saving health care coverage away from more than 90,000 Kentuckians. And the Trump administration hasn't stopped there. They've rescinded regulations on payday loan lenders that prey on those in poverty, proposed cuts of $220 billion to SNAP, and sought to eliminate lie heap. Many will differ on the role of the federal government in combating poverty, but we shouldn't differ on one concept. The more we can do to lift people out of poverty, the better our budgetary future will look. Poverty is more than just a policy issue. It is a challenge to the conscience of our nation. That is why I'm thankful to have the opportunity today to learn about the real everyday experiences of our witnesses and to debunk some of the myths surrounding this vital issue. We need to be making a stronger investment in our people, all our people, so every American has the opportunity to thrive and succeed. I'm sure we will hear a lot of ideas and different points of view today as we look at ways to help working families and struggling Americans, which is the point of this hearing. Whether it's practical or aspirational or even designed to take a sledgehammer to the status quo, we want to provide a platform for community leaders and those directly impacted by federal policies to share their ideas. Once again, I would like to thank the Poor People's Campaign and our witnesses for joining us. I look forward to your testimony. Now I ask unanimous consent to submit 2 documents from the Poor People's Campaign, the moral budget and the audit, in the record. Without objection, so ordered. And now yield 5 minutes to the ranking member, Mr. Womack.
I thank the chairman. Good morning, everyone. Exploring ways to help lift people out of poverty is not new to this committee. In fact, led by then committee chairman Paul Ryan, budget Republicans have a long history of championing policies and programs that help low-income Americans climb the economic ladder, earn their own success, and escape the cycle of poverty. On this issue, we often hear some of our friends across the aisle say that the bigger the price tag, the better the policy. That may sound good on paper, but in practice, it has not achieved the results Americans deserve, especially when it comes to reducing poverty. In 1964, President Lyndon Johnson declared the war on poverty with the goal of not only alleviating the symptoms of those in poverty, but also preventing poverty altogether. Since then, the federal government has directed tens of trillions of dollars towards scores of anti-poverty programs across more than a dozen different agencies. Despite these investments, the poverty rate has only marginally declined. If history is any indicator, more spending, bigger government, and higher taxes, those solutions that have far too often been proposed by some of my friends on the other side of the aisle, are not the tools we need to truly move the needle. Those may address what President Johnson called the symptoms of poverty, but they're not curing it. According to a recent poll by YouGov, 63% of Americans enrolled in some type of anti-poverty program believe the war on poverty is failing. The same poll found that 76% of those enrolled in those programs believe the government should focus on creating more opportunities to climb the economic ladder, not increasing government spending. In fact, adding more dollar signs to our enormous debt will only lead to higher taxes. That often penalizes those who can least afford them, making it even harder to escape the cycle of poverty. I'm especially concerned by the proposed tax increases on low-income Americans that many in Congress are considering, including new payroll taxes and energy taxes. They hit the vulnerable the hardest. So what has paved a pathway out of poverty for low-income Americans? I believe a strong economy, which creates more opportunities to find a job, earn a paycheck, get ahead. Following historic tax cuts and deregulation, families are seeing more jobs. They're seeing bigger paychecks, with average hourly earnings increasing by more than 3%. And the unemployment rate has dropped to 3.6%, its lowest level in a half century. We should be focused on policies that continue this trend and help more people earn their own success, including linking more anti-poverty programs to employment opportunities. Serving our country has also paved a pathway out of poverty for many Americans. They've been given an education, learned skills that are applicable to business and other fields. They have learned leadership skills and the value of working in teams. As someone who spent 30 years in uniform in the Arkansas National Guard, and as someone who chairs the Board of Visitors at the United States Military Academy at West Point, I have seen firsthand how our military has helped improve the lives of young men and women from challenging circumstances. And I know I'm not alone. There are 7 veterans and 1 member currently serving on this committee, 5, including myself, on our side of the aisle, 3 on the Democrat side. And I'd also like to take this opportunity to thank them for their service. Perhaps we can explore this notion of service for individuals and the opportunities made available later in life by the U.S. military as just one component of an anti-poverty program that I think that works. I also look forward to hearing about the roles of our families and communities that they're playing in helping reduce poverty, from providing on-the-job training opportunities to counseling troubled youth to ensuring young people have access to a quality education regardless of their zip code. I don't think there's a person up here who doesn't want to help every American achieve the American dream. But our success should not be measured by dollars spent or beneficiaries added. It should be measured by how many people we're helping lift permanently out of poverty so they can earn a living, provide a better life for themselves and their families. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back my time.
I thank the ranking member for his opening remarks. I would now like to welcome the Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi, to our hearing today. Her continued dedication to helping the 1 in 5 children that live in poverty is what took her from kitchen to Congress, as she likes to say. And America's children have greatly benefited from having such an advocate and leader in their corner. I'm very pleased to now recognize the Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi, for her opening remarks.
I thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, for giving me the opportunity. I thank the bipartisan leadership of the committee for the unanimous consent for the Speaker to be allowed to participate, to listen to the testimony, and to share a few thoughts with you. Mr. Chairman, Poverty in America, Economic Realities of Struggling Families, that being the title. I thank you so much for making this opportunity possible for us to hear. And with all due respect to the distinguished ranking member, after listening to his statement, all the more reason we need to hear from our witnesses as to how public policy affects them. The hearing is distinguished by the testimony of leaders of the Poor People's Campaign. We're grateful for the opportunity to listen and learn from Reverend William Barber, Reverend Dr. Theo Harris, and others. I associate myself with your welcome to them all. Last fall, the Poor People's Campaign sent a letter to Congress calling for a hearing on policy harming America's children. They wrote, "Somebody has been hurting our children and has gone on far too long, and we won't be silent anymore." Well, we didn't get that hearing then. We had our own rump hearing. But now, today, thank you, Mr. Chairman, for making this hearing possible. As the chairman said, my motivation to be in politics, my why for being in government and politics is the 1 in 5 children who lives in poverty in America. I have 5, my husband and I have 5 children. We see what it takes to raise a family, and even under great circumstances, there are challenges, and it just bothered me so that 1 in 5 children in America go to sleep hungry at night. How could this be in the greatest country that ever existed in the history of the world, that 1 in 5 children, at least, lives in poverty in America? And so we must have public policy that does better. And as the distinguished ranking member said, we still have challenges, even though we had a war on poverty, but just think of what the challenge would be if we had not had that war on poverty. And here we are in the Budget Committee. A federal budget should be a statement of our national values. What is important to us as a nation should be reflected in how we allocate our resources. And we have to stand for the education, health, education, and well-being of all of the American people in the budget we put forth. We must fight for investments in economic justice and human dignity, recognizing, as Dr. King said, that our struggle is for genuine equality, which means economic equality. Dr. King's words ring with the same resounding moral force today. As he said, what does it profit a man to be able to eat at an integrated lunch counter if he doesn't earn enough money to buy a hamburger and a cup of coffee? These words are echoed in the Poor People's Campaign moral budget, which states, everyone has a right to live. We thank the Poor People's Campaign for conducting your audit of injustices, the souls of poor folk, which presents a stark reminder of the challenges that remain today. 51 years after Dr. King launched the Poor People's Campaign to finally end poverty. 51 years after workers of every background marched for their dignity, bringing the priorities of America's neediest families to the nation's capital. 51 years later, America is still a land of stunning injustice. Our work is far from done. 140 million Americans are poor in our country. As members of Congress, we have an urgent moral duty to make good on the promissory note promissory note of the rights enshrined in our founding documents. Our nation's founding ideals, liberty and justice for all, can only be fulfilled if we have economic justice led by a government that is in the public interest, not the special interest. And that is why we are grateful for the consideration here of a budget. Just to remind, education is so central to the economic well-being of America's children and working families. Nothing brings more money to the Treasury. Nothing brings more money to the Treasury than investments in education, early childhood, K through 12, higher ed, post-grad, lifetime learning for our workers. This is the investment that people want to make in their children, that our country must make in our future, and it is an investment that has a return. Medicare, Medicaid initiatives that have helped meet the needs of America's working families are so important and should not be undermined in any budget. And the distinguished ranking member mentioned increasing the national debt. We certainly should not have a budget that gives a tax break to 83% of the benefits to the top 1% while adding $2 trillion to the national debt, adding to the debt that will be incurred by our children. Our children, our children, our children. When people ask what are the three most important issues facing the Congress, I always say the same thing. Our children, our children, our children. Their health, their education, the economic success, security of their families, and a safe environment, environmental justice, so important that we focused on in our last hearing. Environmental justice, clean air, clean water for them to thrive in a world at peace in which they can reach their fulfillment. And so, and I'm proud to be here to offer some element of concern, confident in our commitment to ending poverty in America, led by our distinguished chair of our steering committee, Barbara Lee, member of this budget committee, confident about what we believe in and what we want to do, humble enough to listen to how public policy has an impact and to listen to more newer, fresher ideas, fresh eyes on the subject from where it is most felt. So we want to, again, thank the chairman and also call upon our Republican colleagues to help us with issues like raising the minimum wage, lowering the cost of prescription drugs, issues like that which raise the paycheck, lower cost to families. In our work, we must be one, coming together in a spirit of dangerous unselfishness. The Congress cannot succeed in our inside maneuvering without the outside mobilization. We will make our legislation for the good of the American people and our children that is being rejected by the Senate too hot for them to handle by public, believing in and having confidence in the public sentiment to make the Senate accountable as well when it comes to meeting the needs of America's working families and reducing the level of poverty in our country and reducing the number of poor people in our country. Your contribution, intellectual contribution to us today is immeasurable. We're grateful to you for it, but more importantly for the work that you do every day to meet the needs of America's working families, especially those who are on the borderline or live in poverty or on the borderline of being poor in our country. It's an injustice. We must address it, and we must address it in a way that is respectful of the dignity and worth of every person, the spark of divinity that exists in every person, so that we are respectful of other views. And Mr. Womack, I say to you, I am guided by the words of our founders, e pluribus unum, from any one. They couldn't imagine how many we would be or how different we'd be from each other. But we knew that in striving for solutions, we had to be unifying and not dividing. And it is in that spirit of dangerous unselfishness that I welcome our guest. Thank you, Mr. Yarmouth, Mr. Chairman, and you, Mr. Womack, for providing us with this opportunity. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, for your remarks. In the interest of time, if any other member has an opening statement, you may submit that statement in writing for the record. Once again, I'd like to thank our witnesses for being here this morning. The committee has received your written statements. They will be made part of the formal hearing record. Each of you will have 5 minutes to testify. First, we'll recognize Dr. Barber. You may begin when you are ready. You're recognized for 5 minutes. Yes, sir.
Although his voice is resounding. Huh?
Chairman Yarmouth and Ranking Member Womack and members of this committee, I'm Reverend Dr. William J Barber II from North Carolina. I'm the son of a Navy man who gave first-class service first-class blood and service for second-class citizenship. I'm here as part African-American, part Tuscaroran, and part white, so I am diversity looking directly at you. I'm also speaking here today on the thousands of people of every race, creed, and color, gender, and sexuality in the 40 states and District of Columbia that are part of the Poor People's Campaign, a national call for a moral revival. I wanted to be acknowledged today that we are here on the 150th year anniversary of Juneteenth, when slaves finally found out that the Emancipation Proclamation had been written. And here, 51 years after the Poor People's Campaign, it is time for Americans to find out the truth about poverty for all Americans. The growing gap between the rich and the poor in this country is a direct result of policy decisions, not the immorality and the lack of personal work of poor people. Policy decisions made here in Washington and in our state capitals, but those decisions have been supported by well-funded myths. Corporate interests have sent their representatives here to preach personal responsibility and the danger of government intervention. But the truth is, we must take a collective responsibility for the inequality, the unjust laws and systems created. God did not make us poor. Greed and abuse and power make us poor. In this hearing room, you are seated here as members of Congress on the left and on the right, demanding on party affiliation. Our campaign agenda is neither left nor right. It aims to challenge both sides of the aisle. It aims to reach toward the moral high ground. The agenda is rooted in the religious values of the prophet of Isaiah that every legislator ought to hear again since you put your hands on the Bible to swear yourselves into office. Woe unto those who legislate evil and rob the poor of their rights and make women and children their prey. You should hear what Jesus said, not to churches and personal charity, but to nations. When I was hungry, did you feed me? When I was a stranger, an immigrant, did you receive me? When I was sick, did you care for me? Because every nation will be judged by God for how it treats the least of these. Our religious values call us, and our constitutional values, which call us to the issue of justice, establishing justice, to put the marginalized and the poor at the center of our public policy. We began 3 years ago. We've been all over this country, from Kansas to Arizona to eastern Kentucky to eastern North Carolina. We've met with Republicans and Democrats and blacks and whites and gay and straight, and all of them are saying the 140 million, we first must get the numbers right. It's 140 million poor and low-wealth people in this country. 140 million, 39 million children, 21 million seniors, 65.8 million men, 74 million women, 26 million black people, 38 million Latinx people, 8 million Asian people, 2.4 native indigenous people, and 66 million white people. And they are not poor because they are lazy or because they don't engage in personal responsibility. They are poor because of the systemic realities that connect systemic racism, systemic poverty, ecological devastation, the war economy, and the false moral narratives that suggest that somehow you can ignore poverty. Ignore poverty. We must count 43.5% of our nation. No nation can survive when 43.5% of its people are poor and low wealth, and that's not at the center of our public discussions. 62 million people who work every day for less than a living wage. 37 million people without health care, even with the Affordable Care Act. And I'm from the South, where 1/3 of all the poor people live, and it's almost even black and white. 50-some million poor people and low-income people, and 13 million people uninsured. Poverty is a moral crisis. The federal government, state governments, we do not need more tax cuts for the rich. We do not need more missiles. We need to hear and see the voices and faces of the poverty. We must end this systemic policy violence against poor and low wealth people. This is the moral mandate for our nation at this moment. The work of reconstructing America is not done, and we must do it together, and nothing less than the promise of our democracy is at stake. To not deal with poverty is constitutionally inconsistent, it is economically insane, and it is morally wrong. Thank you.
Thank you for your testimony. I now recognize Dr. Theo Harris for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Yarmouth. Thank you, Chairman Yarmouth, Ranking Member Womack, and members of this committee for this opportunity to speak with you today. I come to you this morning, an ordained minister, a biblical scholar, and someone who has been organizing amongst the poor and homeless for over 25 years. First with the National Union of the Homeless, the National Welfare Rights Union, and today proudly with the Poor People's Campaign, a national call for moral revival. Over the past years, the Poor People's Campaign has been building committees of poor and dispossessed people, moral leaders, activists, advocates in more than 40 states across this country. We have met with tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people and chronicled their demands for a better society. We've spent time in my home state of Wisconsin, where the safety net has been shredded over the past decade. Families go without water and heat, even in the cold winter. We've been in Crossett, Arkansas, where a whole town has been poisoned by a paper plant. Grandparents have to meet their grandkids 80 miles from home just to make sure they're not exposed to those toxins. We've been in Pacoima, California, where 1 in 4 children in the Telfair Elementary School are homeless, are without a home. And Altoona, Pennsylvania, where children, young children, babies, are being taken away from their parents who love them, who care for them, who want to raise them because they can't pay some of the highest water bills in the country. Together, we developed a moral agenda that calls for the elimination of systemic racism and poverty, ecological devastation, and militarism in the war economy. It calls for a challenge of this distorted moral narrative that blames the poor for our poverty, tries to pit us against each other, and feeds us the lie that there isn't enough. When we have beautiful, God-given abundance in this world. You on this budget committee know that talk is cheap. Ultimately, it is our deeds that matter. Budgets reflect our deepest values, our most important priorities. And we are here to say this morning that our nation's budget, as it now stands, reflects the values of the rich, of large corporations, of military contractors at the expense of poor, suffering children, families. We are here to say that we need a moral revolution of values that places the needs and demands of the poor and of the planet at the heart of the budget. This will create more jobs, build up our infrastructure, strengthen our economy, and protect our resources today and for future generations. When you lift from the bottom, everybody rises. So I know this from economics and social science. I've also read it in the Bible. Deuteronomy says, if you forgive debts and you increase programs that lift up the poor, if you pay your workers a living wage and you release those who are oppressed, if you lend out money knowing you may not get paid back, your whole society will be lifted up. Your whole nation will flourish. Poverty is people's creation. It is the creation of immoral budgets and unjust policies, and we can choose to end it. The poor will only be with us as long as we are disobedient to God and to the founding creed of this nation. Thank you for listening.
Thank you for your testimony, and now recognize Ms. Callie Greer for 5 minutes.
Thank you, members of the committee.
Push that button. There you go.
Okay. Thank you, committee, for having me here today. My name is Callie Greer. I'm a mother of 5, and I've lost 2 of my children for unnecessary reasons. I'm here to talk about Venus. Venus should be here with us today. So Venus started complaining about a little knot she had on her breast. And so since she wasn't employed and didn't have any insurance, she did what we do in our community. She started visiting a emergency room. And so she would go and they just sent her out, and she kept complaining about the knot, and they didn't do anything for her for a while. Then one night she went to the emergency room, and the doctor walked in the room, and he's like, "What's that smell?" And Venus said, "It's my breast. It's rotting." So that's when Venus got some help. She was diagnosed with stage 4 cancer and was sent to the cancer center, and she had a radical mastectomy and went into chemo and radiation. For a while, Venus was in remission. About 6 months later, she went back, and the cancer was everywhere. She had spots on her lungs, on bones, on the liver, and so Venus had to have a lot of medications and treatments from the doctor. So, but everything Venus was needed, she had to be approved for it. She had to wait to be approved for the medication. So she would wait weeks and sometimes months to get things that she needed. Well, one of the hardest parts of that was for my husband, when Venus was waiting for oxygen. She had to wait about 2 months for the oxygen. But during that time, her dad had to tow her around the house. Yeah. So that was real hard on him, to have to carry his baby around the house. And every time he picked her up, she was lighter and lighter and lighter. So one day, one Friday, Venus was sitting in the chair in the living room, and she said, "Mama," she said, "my head hurt me so bad I can't see." So we took her to the cancer center, and they rushed her to the emergency room, and she had been waiting on a CAT scan that she hadn't gotten. So when we got her there, she lapsed into a coma, and then she got the CAT scan. And she had 2 tumors in her head, and one had ruptured, and she was brain dead. So, yeah. Where I live, we can't just get a mammogram. You have to have a prescription. So since she didn't have a doctor, she couldn't get the mammogram. But if she had had a doctor, if she had had health care insurance, Venus would be here with us. How much would you pay to have your baby saved? You got a dollar sign around the top of your head, a number. How much would you pay? Because Venus should be here. She should not. I should not be here. So since she's not here, I'm here for her, and I'm here for the other 140 million people that are struggling and bearing out babies because they don't have health care insurance. something that we shouldn't even have to ask for. We shouldn't have to ask for this. Something that you would even take this job if you couldn't get. We shouldn't have to ask for this. It's a human right. We shouldn't be burying our babies like this. I'm a little off script, but I just want to let you know that I'm here with the Poor People's Campaign, and I'm fighting this fight. And I'm representing 140 million people today. 140 million. And we're here, we ain't going nowhere. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Greer. I now recognize Ms. Alqass for 5 minutes.
Thank you, members of the committee, for this opportunity. My name is Kenia Alqass. I came to this country from Guerrero, Acapulco, Guerrero, Mexico, as a small child because my mother was escaping poverty. She wanted to give me and my sisters a better life, and she worked very, very hard for it, sometimes working 2 to 3 jobs at a time. She was a cook in 2 restaurants and was a caretaker for an elderly family, elderly couple. When she would lose a job, she would do anything to make sure that we were provided for. She was even a street vendor at times. Families like mine are very common and have many challenges. Because of poverty and systemic racism, families who are undocumented often have to do multiple jobs, get paid under the table, and often that comes with discrimination and mistreatment. To get by, people in our community have to create survival methods, such as getting together to share meals, taking care of each other's children, and creating a community around us to make sure that we have safety nets. Today, I've come from East Los Angeles because I must fight to advocate for my daughter, all children, and my community. No parent should live with the fear of having their children be taken away from them. I sometimes have that fear that immigration officers might come and take me away, and that my child will be ripped from my arms. I fight for the day when no child has to worry about clean water, a good education, or health care. As members of the Budget Committee, you have tremendous power to shift U.S. priorities in ways that it would help 140 million poor and low-income people and for them to have better lives. You could decide, for example, that it is more important to put children into Head Start than into detention centers. Last year, one of the corporations that operate detention centers got $234 million to buy beds for children. With that money, you could have funded Head Start for more than 26,000 children. One policy gives children lifelong benefits, the other one destroys lives. In fact, we've had 5 children die in detention centers this year. Thousands are being traumatized. You could decide that it's more important to send children to college than to send ICE agents to raid workplaces and separate families. Many poor people like me would like to go to college, but we know that there's not enough financial support, even though we know that the benefits of public investment in higher education far outweighs the cost. Meanwhile, the government has had no trouble finding money to stop people from pursuing the right to live with dignity and humanity. The United States spends more money, 8 times more money on immigration, deportation, and border policies per year now than it did in 1976. President Trump would like to spend tens of billions of dollars on a border wall. He claims immigrants are an economic burden, that we steal jobs and public assistance money. The exact opposite is true. The Congressional Budget Office found that if the United States accepted more immigrants, it would created a path to a legal status. The benefits would outweigh the cost by nearly $20 billion a year. Immigrants contribute to this society every day. They work in your communities. They're the gardeners that are mowing your land, the cooks like my mother that are preparing your food, the farm workers who are picking your fruits and vegetables, the nannies who are raising your children. Many of us have been forced to become leaders in our communities, to advocate for our rights, and to fight to have a life that we're not just surviving through, but that we're able to live through with dignity. I am co-director of Unión de Vecinos, and I am the chair of the California Poor People's Campaign, a national call for moral revival. And we are joining a larger community, a community of poor and dispossessed across this country that are yelling and screaming at you. We are the Poor People's Campaign, a national call for moral revival, and we need you. You have been elected to guide this nation, and today we are here to tell you that we need you to end this war economy. You hold in your hand not just the power, but the lives of millions of poor people. My mother crossed the desert to give me a life with dignity and basic human needs, a home, food, and education. I will continue to fight to make sure everybody lives without poverty, systemic racism, ecological devastation, and a violent war economy. And I hope you will too. Thank you.
Thank you for your testimony, and now recognize Mr. Overfelt for 5 minutes.
My name is Chris Overfelt, and I'm with Veterans for Peace. Thank you, Mr. Yarmuth and Mr. Womack. I want you to know that there is not a day in my life that I'm not grateful to live under a representative government. Thank you to all the leaders here. I want to say that I'm not here to try and make you think a certain way. I'm here to present a different side of the conversation, and you can decide what you think is right. It is vital to our democracy that we can disagree and still respect one another. I was an aircraft mechanic in the Air Force National Guard. I was based at Forbes Field in Topeka, Kansas from 2002 to 2011. I worked on the KC-135 aircraft, the airplane that refuels other planes in the air, and I deployed to Turkey and Qatar during the Iraq and Afghanistan wars. Neither of these countries will likely recover from that devastation in my lifetime. Nothing I can do in my life will make up for the hundreds of thousands of Iraqi and Afghan men, women, and children killed in these useless wars. Since our invasion of these countries, terrorism has proliferated tenfold around the world. When I joined the military, I had no idea that never in its history has the Department of Defense done an internal audit of its spending, despite it being mandated by law. It doesn't know how much money it is spending, and it doesn't know how it is spending it. It's a black hole for money. A 2016 Inspector General's report revealed that over the past 2 decades, the Pentagon cannot account for how it spent $6.5 trillion. The Pentagon budget routinely accounts for over half of the federal discretionary budget. It is no secret that there is always enough money for weapons and jails and never enough for education and the poor. Instead of this money going to health care and education for our citizens who so desperately need it, it goes to Boeing, it goes to Lockheed Martin, it goes to Raytheon, it goes to Northrop Grumman, and the list goes on and on and on. When I joined the military, I had no idea that we have 800 military bases worldwide. Why do we keep such a strong presence throughout the world? It's not to keep us safe. It's to provide Western capital with continuous access to foreign resources and markets. Most of the military budget is used not to fight wars, but to exercise soft power in the support of American capital. When I joined the military, I had no idea that all across the world, the United States supports fascist governments through military training and arms deals to ensure that they serve the interests of foreign capital and not the people that they rule over. Honduras, Guatemala, Colombia, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, UAE, Bahrain, the list goes on. And I want to be clear, this does not make us safe. It makes us less safe. And Mr. Womack, I appreciate your comments about getting job skills from the military. I am very grateful for getting my education and my skills as a mechanic and the mentorship I received from the great people in the military. But we do not have to use systems of violence and brutality to try and alleviate poverty here at home. When I left the military in 2011, I began substitute teaching in Kansas City and working at an agricultural mentorship for young people. I've met people here who have also suffered from these wars and the misplaced spending priorities that support them. On my farm and in my classroom in Kansas City, I work with communities that are in direct need of funding. Instead of health care, schools, and early childhood education programs, they only get a militarized police force and punitive mass incarceration programs. 39% of Missourians are low income, and Black residents are incarcerated at 4 times the rate of white residents. We need to change the war economy and use these funds to provide health care and education to everyone. The moral budget says that we can save $350 billion by redirecting our foreign policy away from war and militarism, closing our overseas bases, and refusing to subsidize military contractors. We can also cut 25% of the $179 billion spent on mass incarceration in the form of police courts and private contractors. I want to end by saying that I come here to ask that we stop funding systems of violence and brutality and start funding systems of love that support people in our communities. Thank you.
Thank you for your testimony, and now I recognize Ms. Kenzie for 5 minutes.
Thank you. My name is Savannah Kenzie, and I want to thank you for this opportunity. I am 22 years old, a member of the LGBTQ community, and I am from Johnstown, Pennsylvania, which is a town of about 20,000 people in western Pennsylvania. The population of Johnstown is about 77% white, 14% African American, and 4% Latino. I graduated from Greater Johnstown High in 2014, and even though I graduated, everyday life is still very challenging. This is because the school system is very flawed and doesn't teach the real history of this country. Education should teach all of us to hear and understand everyone's differences and backgrounds that they have come from. Johnstown used to be a booming steel mill town, but once the mills closed, it went downhill. If you've ever heard of my town at all, it's probably because of our opioid problem. I have known a few people who have died, including my friend Nikki. She was poor like a lot of people in Johnstown. In fact, Johnstown has the highest poverty rate of any town in the state. 38% of all people and 63% of people under 18 are living below the official poverty line. Nikki turned to drugs, and that led to going in and out of jail. She never got the treatment she needed, and when she overdosed 2 years ago, she left behind a 4-year-old daughter. Nikki was just 26 years old. Some people say us young people are lazy, but that's not true. Johnstown just doesn't have enough jobs to pay, not enough jobs that pay to live on. I am on disability and Medicaid, and I'm grateful for the help that I get, but it's not enough to get by. And last year, out of nowhere, my benefits for food stamps got cut down to $15 a month. I have tried asking why this was and can never get an answer from anybody. At the grocery store, I sometimes have to put food back or add the charge to my credit card debt because I don't have the cash. What's going to happen when all of my credit card debt is maxed out and still don't have the cash? I am not the only person in this boat that's sinking. There's many others out there too. What has really helped me lower my anxiety is getting involved with Put People First PA. This is a group that gives people like me the opportunity to organize to make things better. To be honest, it's really become like family. I co-coordinate our Healthcare Rights Committee in Johnstown, and I often go door to door talking to people about the need for healthcare for all. It's hard work, but I love the challenge of trying to persuade people to have hope and that we can improve the situation. What makes me sad is when I talk to people who say there's no poverty problem in Johnstown and that they've been told that if you're poor, it's your own fault, or that you should just work harder, or they say that immigrants are the problem. The real problem, I believe, is that a few people are getting very rich while poor people in towns like Johnstown are just forgotten about. Last fall, Put People First PA organized demonstrations against healthcare companies, and one was at Conemaugh Hospital, owned by Duke Life Point in Johnstown. Do you know how much the CEO of Duke Life Point made in 2017? More than $13 million. Meanwhile, people, including some of my own family members, have gotten poor care at that hospital, which has a 1 out of 5 star rating on Medicare.gov. Nobody should get that rich off of a healthcare system that is not even working. And the problems are not just in Johnstown either. Can you believe that the life expectancy in the United States is actually declining because of all the drug overdoses? Life expectancy for African Americans in Johnstown is just 64.8 years, almost 15 years below the national average. That is just crazy. We need to make healthcare a right with universal healthcare for all, and we need more public investment in communities like Johnstown so that everyone has the opportunity to a secure, dignified life, not just the few wealthy at the top. Thank you again for the opportunity to speak with you all today.
Thank you for your testimony, and now recognize Pastor Fields for 5 minutes.
Good morning. My name is Latasha Fields. I am the founder of Christian Home Educator Support System in Chicago, Illinois. I want to thank Chairman Yumeth for having me, the Ranking Member Womack, and members of Congress. It's a blessing to be here today. I have been married to Ronald Fields II for 13 and a half years. We are home educators of 4 wonderful children. I have 2 girls, 22 and 3, and 2 boys, 12 and 9. My husband and I are both born and raised in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. I spent 33 years there before I came to move to Chicago, Illinois, 7.5 years ago to expand our evangelistic work. We serve as the overseers and pastors of our report ministries and publication in Chicago. I am also the founder of Christian Home Educator, which is a homeschool academy, and Christian Home Support System, which is our support group. These are evangelistic outreach ministries to serve and support the families of the city of Chicago and surrounding communities. We provide assistance, resources about home education, cooperative educational and recreational resources, curriculum and parental rights issues, and much more. Our mission is to empower parents to take back the responsibility of educating their children. I am also the state coordinator of parentalrights.org, a volunteer of Junior Achievement of Chicago, and a member of Cure Clergy Network. I also have over 19 years of entrepreneurial experience, with 14 of those years being consecrated in the real estate industry and several certifications in property management and nonprofit housing. I am also a recent graduate of Trinity Christian College in Palo Heights, Illinois, with a bachelor's degree in business administration with a 4.0 GPA. So let me tell you a little bit about my journey, which is nothing short of the grace of God towards me. My grandmother, who raised me, also raised 9 kids of her own, was a homeowner living in a poor black drug-infested community in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. She raised me and my younger sister. My mom was a teenage mom on drugs in and out of prison. My grandmother was a strong woman, hardworking woman. She showed tough love and had amazing independent work ethics. So I basically grew up in the typical black stigma community surrounding me: the lack of motivation for education, promiscuous behavior, drugs, crime, and some on welfare. In spite of the circumstances that surrounded my childhood, I was one that often fought against the odds. I had a love for education. I never did drugs and I never committed a crime. But however, I did fall into promiscuous behavior, and at the age of 17, I became a teenage mom. This was the turning point of my life. I will never forget the day that I found that I was pregnant. I went into a Planned Parenthood in my neighborhood. I was devastated, I was frightened, and I was scared, because I was one of those kids that excelled in school, was popular in school, played sports, was on the homecoming court. You name it, I was in it. So basically, I kept myself from the normalized behaviors that plagued the black community. So becoming pregnant was embarrassing to me. I didn't want to be like the rest. I had always strived to be better. I didn't want to be like the social norm. I didn't want to be another statistic. I didn't want to be the 72% of moms raising a child single. So while waiting for the results of my pregnancy test, I was crying and I was thinking how I had ruined my life. The nurse came back in the room and she told me that I was 3 weeks pregnant, and she consoled me that I had another choice. I had a choice to abort my baby. In that very moment, my life flashed before my eyes because I had a big decision to make. Do I get rid of my baby and proceed as normal, as though nothing happened, and go back to my family and friends and continue to live out my life? Or do I live the rest of my life knowing I had killed my baby? Do I keep my baby and face the challenges that lie ahead of me and press past the shame, the regret, and the disappointment? I chose the latter. I chose to do what I will always hear my grandmother say: you make your bed hard, you lie in it. Those words rang loud and clear in my heart and mind. Yes, we did this. No one else is responsible for the choice we made. I must take responsibility for my actions and live with it. Live the best possible life I can, give my child the best possible life I can, finish high school, go to college, and make something of myself. I decided, in spite of my teenage pregnancy, that I would continue to press past the popularized social norms of the Black community. I worked hard. I graduated from high school 5 months pregnant. During my teenage years, I worked at Burger King. I was a part of an entrepreneurial program that we had. I worked there throughout my high school years from 15 till I graduated, but I was a mom, so I had to continue working at Burger King to provide for myself and my baby. I lived with my grandmother for several months after I had her, and she encouraged me to get on food stamps, to receive WIC, and to receive child care assistance. During this time, she also helped me to get my first apartment. After about 9 months of renting, the real estate company asked me, did I want to buy a house? I was shocked. I was excited. I went through the first-time home buyers program, and I purchased a 3-bedroom, 1-bath house at 18 years old. After 2 years of being on food stamps, I found myself increasingly growing to hate the program. I felt awful while I was on the program. It was such a level of disrespect and deprivation. I couldn't take it any longer. I removed myself from the food stamp program. But however, due to me working and going to college, I had to remain on child care assistance. After having my baby in 1996, buying my home in 1997, the same real estate company offered me a job. I became a secretary, later a rental assistant manager, and later in December 2005, I became a licensed real estate agent. However, from 1996 to early 2005, I was a single mom, working hard, working 2 jobs sometimes, going to college and maintaining honors. By November 2004, I gave my life to Christ, met my husband, we got married October 2005. After becoming a Christian, I became an ordained minister. My faith began to challenge and propel me to work for families and kids and tackle the problems that plague the Black communities. I lived it, and I wanted to reverse the plague. I had begun and purposed in my heart that I would become that change and advocate for my family and friends. In 2006, I felt compelled by God to take more responsibility for my daughter's education. I took her out of the public education in the 4th grade, and I wanted to give her a Christian education by homeschooling her. So we did. My husband and I did not know what that would entail, but we obeyed God. Later, in 2007, we opened up a Christian homeschool academy as an extension of our evangelistic work. My husband and I are now homeowners in Chicago, Illinois for the last 3 years. My husband is the owner of his own barbershop in the South Shore community in Chicago for the last 5 years, and we are continuing our ministerial work with our Christian school and our co-op group to support the families in the city of Chicago.
Pastor Fields, if you could wrap it up, your time is considerably over, so if you could wrap it up. You can make a concluding statement.
Oh, wrap it up, okay. And one more point, that we graduated our oldest daughter, she's 22, from being homeschooled all the way to 12th grade. We graduated her from our homeschool academy, and now she just walked across the stage from the University of Bridgeport with a degree in nutritional science with a 3.1 GPA from being homeschooled. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I now recognize Pastor Mahan for 5 minutes.
Chairman Yarmouth, Ranking Member Womack, all the esteemed members of the House Budget Committee, I thank you for this opportunity to share my family's journey out of poverty. Growing up, my wife and I were raised in lower middle class households, went to public schools, experienced some of the same societal ills far too many American children face: abuse, addiction, divorce, depression. Parents who had more bills than money most months were all part of our building blocks that formed our childhood. In 1993, soon after I completed my senior year, my girlfriend informed me that she was pregnant and that I had some serious decisions to make. I was terrified, confused. As I was, it seemed like everyone around me kind of knew what I should do more than I did. And so my friends thought that we should have an abortion, just go ahead and kill the baby, and then you can just go on with your life. My mother, well-meaning, she decided that I should take care of my children, always, but that it's my wife that I shouldn't marry my wife, that I should just basically take care of the kids. This is later on what I found would lead to about 70% of African-American kids being born in the households without fathers. And so I'm so glad I didn't take that advice. Despite all the advice to the contrary, we decided to keep our baby, get married, and trust the Lord for answers along the way. I went home from being a popular student leader, newly enrolled college student, to a poor college dropout and teen father overnight. The first year of our marriage, I made $11,000 and owed 17 in debt. While living with our relatives, we had to put our baby girl in the bottom drawer of a dresser to sleep because we just couldn't afford a crib. Her nightlight was the orange security light that shone through the window from the back wall of the grocery store. And my wife and I pillowed our heads at a bed that basically they found my alcoholic uncle dead in just months before we moved in. After living with a few relatives and working hard, I finally was able to move my family into a small duplex apartment in a rough neighborhood. Drugs were being sold across the street. The smell of marijuana frequently crept into the house through the paper-thin walls from our neighbors. Shortly after we had our second daughter, I was working several jobs, struggling to study for the ministry. We finally worked ourselves off of the WIC program, and I even started a small cleaning company where I was thankful basically to work and clean out crack houses that were roach infested and everything from property managers that kind of frequented our company. I was working so much that one day when my wife came, I was home between jobs, and my wife came home and said she was looking for me, calling my name, and she said she came downstairs where I was zoned out staring blankly at an empty TV screen with tears streaming down my face. I was demoralized, utterly exhausted, and I felt like I was beginning to lose my mind. However, looking back, I can clearly see how the Lord rescued us time and time again, and how when we felt the weakest, he faithfully stepped in to strengthen us. For instance, once when our car broke down, our only car broke down unexpectedly, we had a friend randomly call the house and say that they got an amazing deal at the auto auction. They bought 2 cars, and so they offered the one that they were currently driving to my wife and I. Another time I came home and I put my bags down in the front room, and I saw my wife weeping in the kitchen, looking at the empty cabinets in the refrigerator, and she said, "Lord, I've never seen the righteous forsaken, nor my seed begging bread." And she prayed that we would have food that night. Her friend called that night and said that her brother was working at the grocery store up the street, said that they had some extra meat they were about to throw away, and that night we all ate steak for dinner. And then there was the year we decided to step out on faith and take our children out of the failing public school system. We could not afford private school. Our family thought that we were nuts, but the Lord connected us to a group of homeschool families in our church who took us in, guided us through the entire process. Years and a whole lot of criticism later, when we were able to move into a better neighborhood and enroll our children into a high-performing high school, we once again recognized the sovereign hand of God in the decision that we made to homeschool our children. 2 poor African-American teen parents with little post-secondary education somehow raised 4 brilliant children with exemplary character who would all rank in the top of their classes, 4.0, 4.3, 4.6, mentoring programs, thousands of hours of community service, G.E. Reagan and merit scholarships, a neuroscience degree from The Ohio State University, double majors. With God's help and a strong community of faith, we were blessed to achieve outcomes that many of our public schools in our area could not, and all from the kitchen table of our modest inner-city home. In closing, I understand the pain of poverty and the sense of hopelessness that it engenders. However, I also understand the hope that comes from personal responsibility, strong marriages and families, and an act of faith in Jesus Christ. While there is a place for poverty relief programs in society, for sure, I feel that our reliance upon them has become excessive, and that many of them have grossly missed the mark of empowering their recipients to achieve self-sufficiency. Today, my wife lovingly serves disadvantaged women in one of the poorest neighborhoods of our city. As a youth development consultant and minister, I serve thousands of youth and families per year, teaching character education and the Word of God all over the country and abroad. We just celebrated our 25th year in marriage together, and our 4 children are absolutely thriving. However, there is nothing special about us but for the fact that we are trophies of God's grace and beneficiaries of the love and kindness of family, friends, and others within our community who committed to love God and love their neighbors. To be clear, Personal responsibility, strong marriages and families, and an active faith in Jesus Christ is the formula that worked for us. This is the formula that worked for our ancestors before us. And this is the only formula that will work for Americans today. Government programs will only prove successful to the degree that they supplement these key factors without supplanting them. And I appreciate your time to come and share my family's story today. It's a big deal in the Mahan house, and I'm free to answer any questions that you might have.
I thank the gentleman for his testimony. We will now begin the question and answer period. I yield 5 minutes to the gentleman from New York, Mr. Jeffries.
Thank the distinguished chair for convening this hearing and for your leadership. And of course, thank Congresswoman Barber Lee for her persistent leadership on this issue within the caucus, and thank all of the witnesses for your presence here today and for your testimony. It seems to me that tackling the issue of poverty should be something that we do in a bipartisan way. Jim Clyburn has frequently raised the issue of the need for Congress to address persistently poor counties. And when you look at the measure of what a persistently poor county is in the United States of America, it's based on the fact that 20% or more of the people have lived below the poverty line for 30 or more years. That's a persistently poor county. And when you look at who represents persistently poor counties in the United States House of Representatives, it's almost equally divided between Democrats and Republicans, both sides of the aisle. Haven't looked at the breakdown in terms of the 116th Congress, but in previous Congresses, in fact, my colleagues on the other side of the aisle represented more persistently poor counties than did members of the House Democratic Caucus. This is an issue that in the past, Dr. King has spoken eloquently about the effort to divide poor whites and poor African Americans from each other, notwithstanding the commonality of condition that can often be found. Dr. Barber, I'd be interested in your take on where the opportunities lie to tackle poverty as a moral imperative, as you've eloquently laid out for the country, but to try to do it in a bipartisan fashion.
First of all, I think that we have to, but I think all of us have to get this right. We're not talking about just addressing poverty a little bit. King talked about ending poverty, militarism and racism, and ecological devastation of war economy. That's why we put together a budget as well as the facts. And the reality is, even with the facts, we got to start what's right. 140 million poor people. We got to stop racializing poverty. Like poverty is some black people that don't work that hard enough. The fact of the matter, there are more white people that are poor than there are blacks. In concentration, there's more whites, but it's actually more African Americans. And so we should come together. I was actually looking at the ranking member state in Arkansas. I just thought I'd look at Arkansas. I think this is Arkansas. It says that in Arkansas, 46% of people in Arkansas are poor and low income. 493,000 of them are black, but 863,000 of them are white. Now, all of those folks are not poor because they don't work hard enough. To have an anecdotal evidence about people working hard enough, they're actually proving our point. People shouldn't have to work 3 jobs. That's the point. People shouldn't work without health care. That's the point. Sure. People shouldn't have to pray to wait for food to come on their table. That's the point. If you're working, you should be making a living wage. You should have health care in the richest nation in the world. Every one of you that come into this chamber, one of the first things you get is free health care because we pay for it. We pay for it. You make sure that, for instance, you have the ability to all your pre-clearance. This lady didn't have that chance.
No.
She didn't have that chance. And so what we've put together for you is an agenda of what can happen if we invest in living wages and how many dollars that can put into the economy for everybody. What can happen if we cut the military budget by $350 billion, and it'll still be higher than Russia, Iran, North Korea, all of them combined. We have a complete plan. We're not here talking about Democrat or Republican. We're not trying to racialize, but that's why we disaggregated the number. We're tired of the racialization of poverty, the partisanism of poverty. What we are saying is you cannot have a society where 43% of your people are poor and low wealth. I don't care if they're from Eastern Kentucky, where we have been, that's predominantly white, or Eastern North Carolina, that's predominantly black. It is wrong, and we have a plan, and we must work together to change this.
Thank you, Dr. Barber. One last question. You also mentioned that the traditional poverty measures don't actually capture the distressed conditions that the American people are confronting in incredibly large numbers. And one of the statistics that has startled many of us, I believe, is the fact that at least half the country has indicated that they couldn't afford a sudden, unexpected $400 expense. That's over 160 million people in the United States of America. How do you think we should measure poverty? And maybe Dr. Theo Harris can address that, or Dr. Barber, I yield to you at your discretion.
I'm going to take one shot and turn it to, we have the official poverty measure and the supplemental poverty measure. The problem is even the official poverty measure didn't really measure poverty at the beginning. The supplemental poverty measure looks at poverty based on the federal poverty line, but also those who are less than 200% of the federal poverty line. And what it shows us is that that is a broader measurement. It gives us a truer picture. And if we're going to have this conversation, let's start with the facts, not the phoniness, not the mythology, but let's start with the facts of what's happening to 43.5% of the country. Liz?
Yeah, indeed. We actually need a more effective poverty measure. We need to not just talk about a food budget when housing is one of the biggest expenses, when healthcare and healthcare crises, when 73% of this country can actually have healthcare insurance and still not be able to afford many of their basic healthcare services, we got a problem.
Thank you.
Gentleman's time has expired, and now recognize the gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Johnson, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And well, I tell you, I want to thank all of our witnesses for being here today. This is a really, really important hearing because the issue of poverty in America is very real. I know because I've got some personal experience with it. And I know many of you are going to look up here and say, yeah, right, okay? But let me give you a little bit of my background. I was born on a two-wheel wagon rut mule farm. We had no indoor plumbing. We cooked and heated on two big old black pot-bellied stoves. We farmed with mules up until I was about 13 years old. We went to the store once a month, and that was to get sugar and salt if we had the money to do it. Everything else came from the sweat of our brow and the toil of our hands in growing and raising what we consumed. My mother worked 3 or 4 jobs, picking cotton, picking tobacco, working on produce farms, you name it. We didn't know we were poor. We thought we lived like everybody else did in the community in which we were raised. Mother had to find a way to take care of 2 kids. So she lied about my age. Mom's dead now, so I can say that. You can't go after her. But she lied about my age to start me to school when I was 5 years old. And because my dad was an alcoholic and she had to jump from place to place to try to find a job because he wasn't providing much input, we were all over the place. 13 schools in 12 years. So education was a big, big problem for me. I didn't get a very good one in elementary school and middle school and high school. And thank God that I lived in a country that helped provide some opportunities. I see a lot of testimony here about Christian principles. We got 2 reverends, 2 pastors, and a lot of people with Jesus signs on their shirts. I've been a Christian since I was 10 years old. And I'm going to tell you, the scriptures that I read, one of the problems that we've got in this country, it's not a head problem, folks, it's a heart problem. Oh, yeah. Because I don't find anywhere in the scripture where Jesus said that it was Caesar's job to feed the poor and to clothe the widows and to take care of the orphans. He said it was the church's. It's the church's responsibility. It's the community's responsibility. It's your neighbor's responsibility. It's your responsibility as a neighbor to do those things. Pastor Mahan, I find your testimony especially inspiring, both because we're fellow Ohioans, and I plan to get with you because I got some I got some thoughts to share with you later. But because you, too, have thought a lot about how fathers and father figures can impact the lives of children and young adults. I wrote a book about that called Raising Fathers that was published in 2017. We can talk more about that later too, but in your work with at-risk youth, can you describe the effect that a strong male role model can have on young people and their ability to overcome poverty and succeed in the future?
First of all, I appreciate your kind words. I have not seen a more powerful influencer in anti-poverty in a kid's life than a father. Obama said that the leading cause for child poverty was fatherless homes. I've seen it go the positive way, and I've seen it go a negative way. I've seen it where we've got mentoring programs, we're working with kids, father gets out of jail, and that power of a father comes in and undoes everything we did in the mentoring program. But I also see it work in the opposite way, where we can be fathers to the fatherless, where we can go into communities where 80, 90% of the kids have no dads. We can be coaches, we can be mentors, we can be teachers, and turn that kid's life around too by being a father to somebody that didn't have one. It's just it's something that can't be understated, and that's my biggest piece. When I come into the room and I'm hearing folks talk about, I don't hear anybody saying we don't want to end poverty. What I'm hearing is that you've got some that are talking about intentions, and you've got some that are talking about results. And this is not new. We've got the war on poverty that started years ago. We had 7% of the kids in America that were born in homes without fathers. At the end of the daggone thing, today we got 42% of kids in America that have no fathers.
Yeah. Pastor Mahan, I wish I could take all day with you, but let me get to Pastor Fields real quick. Access to quality education is often referred to as the silver bullets for success in life. Can you talk just briefly about some ways that has played out in your life or the lives of your children? What role has federal policy had in your and your children's education?
It has been a tremendous blessing. And like I said, I pulled my daughter out in 4th grade, and so we began to homeschool. And what we've seen, what education has done, because of course me and my husband are products of the public education system, but because I've always been a stickler and an advocate for education, with homeschooling my children, their education was unlimited. It was vast. So we were able to give them a quality education. And I believe some of the ones here were saying that even teaching our children our history. So we was able to give them that the public school has failed to give them. And so with me going back to school and just recently graduating in December, I am an advocate for education. I understand where our federal dollars are being spent in order to give us those opportunities to get an education. So education is definitely a key for our children and for society to succeed and to come out of poverty.
Okay, thank you very much. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you. The gentleman's time has expired. And now recognize the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Boyle, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I want to just say thank you to each and every one of the 8 witnesses for both the head and the heart that was present in each one of your different testimonies. One of the things I've noticed in our political discourse, and this is not just in one campaign, it's throughout many campaigns, sometimes some people use a very dishonest frame. They'll say there are the economic issues, and then there are the moral issues. And the moral issues, typically, they're referring to a few hot-button social issues. And then they'll say, oh, but then there are the economic issues. Taxes and spending and budgets. I believe that is wrong. The economic issues are moral issues. And this really goes back to our founding documents, because we're a nation born not of one race of people, but of a commitment to a certain set of principles and ideals. In our founding documents is the acknowledgement that all of us, by virtue of human beings, have certain rights. However, if we don't have the economic ability to participate fully in those rights, then those rights remain just abstract. That is something that the UN Declaration on Human Rights recognized over half a century ago, which the United States led the drafting of and have signed up to it, including in that document, by the way, a commitment for universal health care as a human right. Now, I want to transition just briefly, because there are so many different topics that were raised from education to housing to opioids. And I wanted to focus specifically on opioids. And Ms. Kenzie, Savannah, thank you for your testimony. As a fellow Pennsylvanian, you make me proud. I thank you especially for sharing the story of your friend, and I'm sorry for her loss and the loss that you've experienced for Nikki. The opioid epidemic is horrible in all 50 states, but for our home state of Pennsylvania, for the Commonwealth, it's nothing short of a catastrophe. In my hometown of Philadelphia, we, I'm sad to say, lead the nation among major cities for opioid deaths. It is something that I've spent a lot of time on, as it has been especially a scourge in my own community and my own district. I was wondering if you could speak to the ways in which our SNAP program, Medicaid, and other financial systems actually make it harder to break that cycle of addiction, the way the economic conditions actually exacerbate the cycle of addiction, and if you had any ideas or thoughts on ways we could make it easier for people to kick that opioid epidemic addiction, knowing that it would A, be the right thing to do, but B, in the financial interests of society to help them do so.
Thank you. So to the last part of your question, I'll just answer that first.
Yeah.
I believe that putting folks in prison for opioid epidemic is not the way to do it. I believe a treatment center would be the correct route, just because going into prison, you don't even get treatment or very little treatment. And then it just turns to in and out, and then eventually it just leads to death and doesn't end anywhere well. And then can you repeat your first question? I'm sorry.
No, that's good. I was the first part was talking about the ways in which the system that we've created actually makes it more difficult to break this cycle of addiction.
Okay.
And it's not a quiz. If you don't have anything to offer, then don't worry about it. But I think that it's so important that we listen to voices, the lived experiences, people like yourself, because I think in many ways those are the voices we don't hear enough of here in Washington.
Yeah. So I don't really feel like food stamps and the WIC program and stuff like that really affect like the opioids like in a bad way. Like I feel like by not I might be misunderstanding your question, but I feel like by not having the money for all of them, I feel like it affects it tremendously just because you end up like your mental health is just declining. And I mean, I've not experienced it personally. I've just known folks, but just from what I've heard and all of that and living there, it's just like, so you go to the store and you can't afford food for your family. Like I know a lot of us have talked about children, and like that's very depressing to not be able to, afford food for your family. And like just the route of my friend Nikki, like she actually was just like smoking weed with her friends, and so she was smoking and they ran out of weed. So a friend of hers actually said, try opioids, like, try heroin. It's just, it's just as good. Like, nothing's going to happen. So, they were poor because, they ran out of the weed and then, like, so.
Okay, the gentleman's time has expired, and now recognize the gentleman from Missouri, Mr. Smith, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. 65 days. 65 days. That's how many days that have passed that we have not did the responsibility of this committee, and that is to pass a budget. Budget hasn't even been filed amongst the Democrats. Nancy Pelosi, who spoke in this committee just at the very beginning, said that a budget is a statement of your values. Show us your values. That's whenever her party was in the minority. just a few years ago. I'm asking Speaker Pelosi and the House Democrats to pass a budget. We're having a hearing today on poverty. Poverty hits home directly to me. But before we can address a lot of the issues in poverty, we have to do a budget, which was supposed to be done 65 days ago. File a budget. Let us talk about it. Let us see your values. House Republicans have a budget. Take up ours if you don't want to take up yours. President even has a budget. When we talk about the area that I represent in southeast Missouri, it's called the Boot Hill. It is a very impoverished congressional district. We have over 200 miles of the Mississippi. My family's called that district home for 7 generations. Growing up in high school and in college, I would go work on my grandparents' farm. Whenever I'd work at my grandparents' farm, in order to wash my hands after working cattle or picking up rocks, clearing brush, to wash my hands, I had to pump water out of a cistern. My grandparents never had running water. They died not having running water. So I understand what poverty is all about. More than 20 of my 30 counties are persistent poverty counties in the 8th Congressional District. It's a very impoverished area. But you know what my family always taught me? My father was a minister. My parents showed a lot of love. They've been married for more than 55 years. But they taught me that hard work and determination and support from your family can do a lot. And a lot can happen from a family that had nothing. And so there is a way to get out of poverty. Lyndon B. Johnson declared war on poverty over 50 years ago. And since then, we've spent over $25 trillion on different government programs. We had 36 million people in poverty in the 1960s when we granted the war on poverty. Now there's over 40 million, according to the statistics from the government. I know that you all said 140 million, but 40 million. So regardless, it's increased, but we've spent $25 trillion. Those 40 million that's considered in poverty right now, we spend $1 million a year in 80 different federal programs to help those that are in poverty. If we just took that $1 trillion and divided it up amongst those 40 million people, that'd be over $20,000 a year in a check. I'd say the federal government's not doing a good job at trying to get people out of poverty. Think about those numbers. We have a poverty trap in these 80-plus federal programs. We've had people come and testify before Congress that says, you know, I work 40 hours a week at the local convenience store. I have to get child care subsidies. I get assistance with my rent. I get food stamps. But I got a $2 pay raise, and guess what? I lost my child care subsidies. My food stamps got reduced. There's a certain level, according to our federal programs, our welfare programs, that they push people down. And that should be a Republican and Democrat issue, is to reform that. We want people to better themselves every day, to gradually work themselves off the system. That's a way that we can do it. We don't want to keep people on the system. We want them to have a better quality of life. So many people are worried about that security blanket. But if they can see the progress of a better life, it's good. When I go into the schools and I talk to the kids in Hayti, Missouri, or in Crothersville, or Kennett, or Bunker, I say it doesn't matter what zip code you're born in or what family you're born in. If you get a good education and you work hard, you can do a lot. But love also helps. So I think the churches, being the son of a pastor, The love that you can nourish these folks is amazing. And I could say so much more, but poverty hits home. It's an important topic, but before we can even hit it, let's get a budget done. Thanks, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman's time has expired. I now recognize the gentleman from California, Mr. Khanna, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Reverend Barber, thank you for your incredible moral leadership in this country. Thank you to all of the witnesses for taking time to come and testify before Congress. Reverend Barber, I want to ask your wisdom and candid advice to this committee. Representative Barbara Lee, about a week ago, led a group of us down to hear President Carter teach Sunday school. And President Carter had a hip injury, and 3 weeks later, he's at the pulpit teaching, showing his resilience. And there are two things he said that struck me. One, he talked about a phone call he had with President Trump. And President Trump said to President Carter, "I'm concerned about China." And President Carter said, "Well, China hasn't been in a war since 1979. We've been in over 40 conflicts. And if we had taken those trillions of dollars and invested it in our infrastructure, in our education, and in high-speed rail, and in broadband, we'd probably be in a much better place." And then President Carter talked about what he thought it meant for America to be a superpower, informed by his own understanding of the teachings of Jesus and his own Christian faith. And he said what it means to be a superpower, in his view, is a place where leaders from around the world would come to Washington to seek our guidance and counsel on how to bring peace, where people would come to look to America in understanding how to bring justice. President Carter, as I know it, is the last president who actually ran on cutting the defense budget and won. He talked about 5 to 7% cuts in defense. And here's the reality, Reverend Barber. Representative Lee and I introduced an amendment in this committee to freeze the defense spending, not to cut it, to freeze it to the levels that Donald Trump has in 2019. We only got 7 votes for that. Now, the arguments we hear is, well, we can't shut down government, the Republicans are in charge in the Senate, the president has to sign something, we need a budget. And I'm sure they're well-meaning arguments, but Reverend Barber, I would like your counsel to this committee, to this Congress. Given all the constraints, how do we succeed in making the case and standing up for responsible cuts in defense?
You know, I come from somebody who, and the people here who remember, who know that we were deeply impacted by government, by Caesar, if you will. And it took religious people who had to stand up to Caesar when Caesar said separate but equal. There wasn't but one dissenter, Justice Holland out of Eastern Kentucky, that stood up to that, but he stood up. And because he stood up, he eventually brought other people to his position, and we won. Somebody has to stand up to the lies. I've heard so many distortions here today, it actually hurts my head. I mean, to suggest that these people who work hard, we all have to tell our stories and our children, but to somebody to say, well, Jesus never said anything about Caesar. First of all, it's interesting that you all would define yourself as Caesar. That in itself is kind of strange. I mean, we need to stop for a minute to even hear that.
Yeah.
And then the next thing is that you haven't read the 2,000 scriptures in the Bible that talk about how societies have supposed to treat the poor, the immigrant, the least of these, and left out. And you don't know that Jesus started his first sermon with good news to the Patokos. That's a Greek word which means those who have been made poor by economic systems. I mean, it really is shocking that folk are saying the same thing that we heard people say about slavery. Slaves just work hard and wait. Civil rights, we don't need to be involved, just work hard and wait. Social Security, you know, same people are against Social Security, and they say God was against it. It is bothersome that in the 21st century, we still have these weak, tired old mythologies lying about the war on poverty when the Russell Sage Foundation actually says that it did decrease poverty, but we left the field. So I would say to all of us, Democrats and Republicans, we brought you people, Republicans, Democrats, whites and black, see the people, stop just talking about I know poverty, and hear what these folk are saying, and put together a full plan to deal with this issue. This is traumatic to see this happening in America today, that people would stick with their partisan line and ignore the people that are really hurting.
Gentleman's time has expired. I now recognize the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Flores, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Yarmouth, and thank you, Republican Leader Womack, for holding this important hearing about poverty in America today. I come at poverty from a personal perspective after my family started, or my early years were in poverty, and I remember there were nights when my dad would come home after working hard and say, well, the soup's going to be a little thin tonight. And we were able to persevere and ultimately prosper, but there was no Medicaid, there was no SNAP. All we got was a little bit of help from friends from time to time from the community, and my dad's hard work, and I was blessed to be able to go to a quality public school that didn't have a lot of federal mandates or oversight over it. It was local leaders that decided how they wanted to educate their kids, and they did a wonderful job with it. And we ultimately persevered. But along the way, I started working at 9, threw papers at 10. And by age 13, I was driving a tractor, building fence 6 days a week, 12 hours a day during the summer times. And again, there was no federal support along the way. I'm not saying the federal government doesn't have a role. I'm just trying to say it is not the end-all, be-all. But what my early life did tell me is that there is a value to work, and that paychecks and good jobs can solve a lot of issues. And so that leads me back to where we are today. By all accounts, our economy is very strong today, and average hourly wages have increased by 3.2%, which is significantly higher than the 2.3% of the last 10 years. And this recovery has been broad and it's been deep. Unemployment for African Americans and Hispanics and females is at record lows. Wage growth in the bottom 10% of our nation's workforce is 50% greater than that income growth in the top 10%. The first time that income equality has shrunk in the last several years. So strong economies open a lot of doors. They lift all people. We have more jobs available today than we have people to fill them. So my view is I come at this, again, from a perspective of how do we help people have the workforce training programs that they need, an education system that understands the needs of the future, and flexibility for students and youth to access more options to apprenticeships and technical schools. And while we may have disagreements about how to best lift low-income Americans out of poverty and into prosperity, I believe it's important to have this discussion. My questions start with a question for Pastor Fields. Now, I believe one of the key ingredients for success for at-risk youth is a stable family and a stable household. Unfortunately, a lot of our at-risk youth come home to an environment that's not healthy, and they don't live in encouraging communities. Are there examples of successful anti-poverty programs that you have been a part of that address these problems for youth?
Thank you, Member Flores. Yeah, and that's I'm hearing everybody testify as well over the same thing, and I'm finding it hard to understand why, when the word is said hard work, why is that interpreted in a different way? I realize all of us sitting here, everyone in this room has worked hard to some extent. But what we're saying is, and I believe you all would agree, that even where you all sit as representative, Congress, and senators, you did not do it by not working hard. And so we just need to understand what that word means. We're saying that you have to persevere, you have to endeavor. And for me, I grew up in the same environments that everyone sitting here is testifying about. Again, my mother was on drugs, in and out of prison. My grandmother did not have federal aid. My grandmother bought a house in 1972 working as a janitor at Louisiana State University. So before the civil rights, there was no federal aid. There was no welfare and food stamp. So I'm sorry if I come from an environment where I have seen that you do not have to rely on government. Right. You can work hard and persevere no matter how long it takes, and that's what I did.
And that takes us to our question. Well, give us examples of successful community programs that help restore healthy families so that we can have that economic success. Your story is a great one.
I mean, like I said, I got the food stamps for a couple of years, so I'm not here to say totally dissolve it. People do need help, but what I'm here to say, and especially working in the real estate industry, it doesn't have to be perpetual. You know, you got families that pass Section 8 and welfare down like it's an inheritance. The Bible says we ought to lay up an inheritance for our children's children, and it's not government entitlement.
Pastor Mahan, we've talked a lot about the inputs into anti-poverty programs where we are trying to solve the effects of poverty, but we don't look at the underlying causes of poverty. Can you walk us through what should our approach be to anti-poverty programs instead of looking at trying to solve the effects, solving the impact, going after the impacts?
Empowerment is, to me, I think empowerment is the key. You know, empowering a single father, empower a single mother to get back on her feet to where she can do so in a way that builds dignity and not dependence. To answer the other question, I would say the churches, in my opinion, have been probably some of the strongest organizations to deal with these issues, and especially the opiate piece of it in Ohio. Our faith-based opiate programs have been phenomenal all across the state to where they're always at the governor's office talking about the successes of their programs. In my personal life, it was the church. They got me involved in homeschooling when everybody thought we was crazy. They got me involved and even opportunities for employment and things like that. And so that would be the number one organization I would say that we would need to empower a little bit more with the TANF and things like that. But again, can they do so and still be able to preach Christ and to have the same worldview and positions that basically made them conspicuous to the government in the first place? Right. Man, wow, you guys are doing an amazing job, but then when I give you money, you know, we don't want to talk about what made you so successful.
I want to apologize, Chairman, for going over my time, but I do appreciate all of your testimony as we work together on this very important issue. Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you. The gentleman's time has expired. I now recognize the gentlelady from Connecticut, Ms. DeLauro, for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and I just want to say a thank you to Reverend Barber, to Dr. Theo Harris, and to all of our witnesses this morning. It's very, very compelling. I just want to make a couple of points here. First, to start out with some of my colleagues have talked about a budget resolution. Keep in mind that 2 years ago, the other side of the aisle did not have a budget resolution. 4 years ago, the side of the aisle did not have a budget resolution. We have moved forward with looking at appropriations committees that will do precisely what we're talking about doing here today, is help lifting people out of poverty. So this is a critically important hearing. The issue of eradicating poverty, addressing people's economic security, is at the heart of what we do in this body. Because the biggest economic challenge facing American families is that their pay is not keeping up with their rising costs. They struggle to deal with health care, prescription drugs, and child care, and a number of other areas. And I am reminded of a quote by Robert F. Kennedy, which I think is very fitting here this morning, and his quote is, "I believe that as long as there is plenty, poverty is evil. We live in a land of plenty. Poverty is evil. And government belongs," he further said, "wherever evil needs an adversary and there are people in distress." People are in distress in this country, and we are the government. And we need to have a role in what is going on here. Let me just talk about those who would say that we went to the war on poverty with Lyndon Johnson and nothing happened. Wrong. We created a social safety net, and that social safety net includes Social Security, lifts 26.5 million people out of poverty, and I might add religiously, it was Leo XIII, who's a Pope Leo XIII, who talked about a Social Security program. He didn't call it Social Security, but he said we need to take care of other generations. The Earned Income Tax Credit, the Child Tax Credit, 9.1 million people lifted out of poverty. The SNAP program, 4.5 million people lifted out of poverty. SSI, 3.3 million housing assistance, 2.5 million people. We have reduced poverty in this country with the creation of a social safety net, which there are some people who are serving today in this body would like to decimate because they don't believe government should be involved in this area. This is not self-serving. I wrote a book 2 years ago called The Least Among Us, Waging the Battle for the Vulnerable. And you know what I found when I went to look at the creation of a social safety
safety net in this country, it was Democrats and Republicans. It was a McGovern and a Dole who said, people are hungry in this country, we need to do something about it. It was a Jake Javits who said we need to have housing assistance for people. That is a role of government. It was the Kennedys and the Schweikerts and others who came together saying we have an economic challenge, we face it together, and we move on these issues. So that to say, when you talk about empowering somebody, how does a person get empowered? Just by saying you are empowered? You don't do that. We need to take a look at what the problems are and identify them. I just want to make this other point. This is not we have a social safety net in this nation. It's being frayed and is being decimated and hollowed out. And if we are not willing on both sides of the aisle to stand up and make the fight for the strength of that social safety net. And Reverend Barber, you talked about the supplemental poverty measure, which is the measure we currently use. And when Mr. Jeffries asked you that question, you said that's the one that we should use, but we should redefine poverty. You should know that today in this body, and Barbara Lee and I are leading this letter, we have the use of the chained CPI, which is now being talked about by this administration, that would in fact create a new measure for poverty that would decrease the number of poor people, that would put more people in jeopardy. This is what the answer is by some of the folks here. This is what it is. And I'm just going to ask you and admonish you, please help us to fight back on this chain CPI effort, because it's wrong and it will hurt the most vulnerable people. The other effort that you need to be engaged in, excuse me, I am pontificating, you may say this, but the child tax credit. We have legislation called the American Family Act, which would increase the child tax credit for children over 6 years old and those under 6, the kids who are the most vulnerable in this country. And I would just tell you that the National Academy of Sciences did a report called A Roadmap to Reducing Child Poverty, that if we did something like the American Family Act, we could reduce child poverty by 50% in the next decade. That measure is coming up in short order in this body through the Ways and Means Committee. All of the advocacy that all of you can muster needs to be focused on this child tax credit that is for the most vulnerable children in the nation, and those children who have been left behind. And we could do a remarkable amount of work if we were there. I'm sorry there's no question, but there have been so many questions, I felt the necessity to respond to some of the charges that have been made here this morning. Thank you.
Thank you. Gentlelady's time has expired. Now recognize the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Musser, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman. Thank you as well, Republican Leader Womack. Thank you all very much for being here with us today. I think it somewhat goes without saying that we do have a very strong economy today. There have been 6 million jobs created just in the last couple of years. We have an unemployment rate of 3.6%, lowest in 50 years. Opportunities are there. When I got into the workforce, it was 1987. And these times are reminiscent of those times. There are choices, there are opportunities. And we still are a nation where people can move from low income to high income. I don't think that's terribly disputed. Now, on the same note, I'm in a district where our unemployment rate is higher in Pennsylvania, and Pennsylvania's ninth than the national average. And the opportunities perhaps aren't exactly what we want them to be, but we're going to continue to work for that. Personal charities are very important as well. I've experienced and worked with from the United Way to Head Start programs to something that was an organization up by me known as the Wyoming Valley Children's Association. I was the chairman of for a couple of years. They're very important. All of us here have seen firsthand the need to provide a hand from time to time, and sometimes longer than that. So that goes without saying. JFK also did say that the best form of welfare is a good-paying job. So I'd like to first ask Pastor Fields and Pastor Mahan, you both have exemplified effort and courage, but sometimes in our society, effort and courage aren't enough. They do require purpose and direction. So could you share with us how you found your purpose and direction and how you found it?
Number one, I know for a fact I found mine in Christ. You know, as Pastor David said earlier, it's in the things of God that I found my strength and my purpose. And also finding Christ, I found the sense of family, how important family is. And so when we cover ourselves with Christ's presence and family, that's how you find your sense of purpose. That's where your strength comes from. And so for me, that is my personal testimony. My faith in Christ and me and my husband raising our children, and we're seeing the strength of family is how we're surviving. That's how we're protected, because we have family.
Thank you. Pastor Mahan?
Yeah, it's, you know, I'm right there as well. And again, I'm not here to debate anybody. I'm here to give my testimony, something that has been done, something that has succeeded. And I'm just saying that the reason for that success is Christ. And I know that, you know, we're in a, you know, we're at the Capitol and everything, but the reality is that is my inspiration. Trust in the Lord with all your heart. Lean not into your own understanding. In all of your ways, acknowledge him and let him direct your path. He directed me to homeschooling. He directed me away from the public system that was failing our community. He's the one that directed me to the people that gave me opportunities for employment and opportunities to increase my, you know, education and things like that. And now I end up here to share my testimony, and somehow I don't want to communicate that somehow it was the government or some great works of David Mahan that did that. It was Christ and Christ alone. And as simplistic as that answer is, that is my answer.
To empower you, to create opportunities, to motivate you, to make you want to make the most of the day.
Yeah, to get my head up off the pillow, to keep working, to keep directing my children in the path that they should go. Again, you know, the context of poverty is important, and family, in that context, man, you can get through anything. And what I was bringing up earlier with the whole beginning of the war on poverty is that this is something we need to talk about. 7% of kids were being raised in homes without fathers. After it, now we have 42, 50% of Latinos, 72% of African Americans. We've destroyed the context that allows people to overcome any obstacle, whether it's poverty or anything else, and that needs to be addressed. Again, I'm not against, you know, public endeavors and government endeavors to avoid poverty. However, I am against them if they subvert that unit of the family.
All right, thank you. Chairman, I yield back my time.
Gentleman's time has expired. I now recognize the gentleman from North Carolina, Mr. Price, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I, too, want to thank our leadership of our committee for holding this hearing, and I want to thank all of our witnesses. I, of course, want to pay a special greeting to Reverend Barber. His work as the leader of the Moral Monday, the inspiration and the leader of the Moral Monday movement in North Carolina has moved our state, and now to have that work transferred to the national level with the Poor People's Campaign, we are appreciative and have great hopes for this movement. A lot of talk this morning about our own personal histories and personal experience. I'll reflect briefly on that and do want to then pose a question. I had the good fortune to come to social and religious and political maturity as the civil rights movement swept across the South. One of the things that the civil rights movement, I think, taught us was that individual morality is not enough. In religious terms, we needed to rediscover the Hebrew prophets. You know, I grew up surrounded by upstanding people, self-reliant people, loving, kind people, and I learned a lot from them. But I also learned, as I looked around the community, that many of those same people were perpetuating systems that denied other people their humanity. either through their active perpetrating of such systems or their failure to challenge such systems, social and political systems that were denying others their humanity. And the civil rights movement spoke to that. Our faith is not just about our individual morality and self-reliance. It is about the kind of community we wish to be. Rediscover the Hebrew prophets. And when it comes to providing for our children, of course we provide for our children, but we have to care about other people's children. We have to care about the kind of educational opportunities that are available across the community. It's not just about protecting ourselves or withdrawing. It is about working for a public education system, I would say, that serves the entire community and that lifts up the entire community. That is what our faith requires us to do, not simply to provide for ourselves. I have a particular role here as the chairman of the Transportation and Housing Appropriations Subcommittee, and so I want to just put an issue on the table, realizing that I've taken a good bit of the time that might be used for an answer. I want to talk about evictions. Affordable housing crisis in this country has many dimensions, but one of them is rising eviction rates and foreclosures. This is a problem across many communities. It does have a particular effect in communities of color. I won't give the statistics except to say that we have virtually erased all the gains made since the Fair Housing Act in 1968 by virtue of the rate of foreclosures and evictions. And black home ownership has declined as a result in the last 10 years, declined 7 percentage points. And now TARP and other programs designed to deal with this are winding down. So my question, Dr. Barber, for you and for any others who want to chime in, is you have a section in your budget on affordable housing, which we are glad to see and will study carefully. What would you say, though, about eviction rates and foreclosures and the kind of effect that is having on community health and well-being as TARP winds down? How might we carry forward such efforts as we have made here? And of course, these efforts have not been totally successful, but I would just appreciate your reflections on that issue.
Let me yield to Dr. Theo Harris and just continue to say we have to look at all of this comprehensively, but let me yield to her.
So I just want to start by saying I'm stunned that basically we've had unanimous acknowledgement that poverty is widespread across this country. We have pulled a group of testifiers who are deeply personally impacted by these problems. They are in the room and people are not talking to them.
Oh.
People are not asking questions about how are we going to solve this problem of homelessness and an increased rate of evictions. And then people are being blamed for the problems that this society has caused. How is it that you can say the war on poverty failed when it is politicians who defunded that war? How can you say that Head Start is a personal charity when it has lifted 65 million children out of poverty since it was started? So it feels very important to me to say we need a real, serious conversation in this country, led by those that are most impacted. And I love this question of, does the Bible say anything about what nations, what Caesars are supposed to do? Because Matthew 25 says, I was hungry to the nations, not to a church, not to a charity, not to an individual. I was hungry. And what did your nation do? I was homeless. And did you cut public housing? Or did you start building new public housing? I was homeless. And did you allow banks to be bailed out? But families who owe more on their houses than they're worth to become homeless. We have a moral crisis in this country. It is a crisis when 250,000 people can die every year because of poverty. And people in this committee can admit that in your towns there are people hurting. Well, what are you going to do about it? What are you going to do about it? No. And when we talk about housing subsidies, we heard the power of them. You got a loan. Yeah. You were able to get a house. That is government helping out. You were on food programs. That is the government helping out. We need more of these programs. We need to lift wages. How is it possible that in this country there's not one county where if you're working minimum wage, you can afford a 2-bedroom apartment?
Reverend,
So we got to connect this housing and this poverty and these wages and lift the load of poverty.
Thank you very much. Gentleman's time has expired. Now recognize the gentleman from South Carolina, Mr. Timmons, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank all the witnesses for taking the time to come and testify before us today. Poverty is a serious issue in this country and in my district, and I look forward to working with all of my colleagues to do everything we can to improve the lives of everyone. My colleague, Mr. Hearn, is particularly passionate about this, and I would like to yield the remainder of my time to him. Thank you.
Thank my colleague from Pennsylvania, or from North Carolina, rather. South Carolina, one of the Carolinas. Yeah, I'm sorry. No, I really appreciate the opportunity. Mr. Chairman, this is something that's very near and dear to my heart, and the ranking member knows this. I have spent a lifetime working to help people get a first job. I always say that the only way you really know how something really truly affects people is having lived it. And many of you have read my story before you came in and looking at the panel, but I grew up in extraordinary poverty, and you know, I appreciate what you all are doing here. I really do, because I think it is something we need to address in this country. And not only here, but you know, we've got issues around the world that so many people are involved in. But I always say, before we help around the world, we should look at our country as well. This is still the greatest nation on this planet, but we need to do a better job of doing things to help people that really need it. I looked at a lot of things that Martin Luther King said, and I think we all look at how to solve a problem, and there are multiple ways to solve a problem. I look at his dream, and I think of what he said. He says, change does not roll on the wheels of inevitability, but comes through the continuous struggle. And so while we must straighten our backs and work for our freedom, a man can't ride unless your back is bent, and I agree with that completely. I'm a product of, like some of these folks have said in here, I'm a product of being in poverty and found the only way out was to work my tail off. And I'm here today at 57 years old, soon to be 58 years old, to say that there are times, the safety net, I wouldn't be here today, I'm certain of that. The safety net of getting a helping hand was very instrumental in my early life. It didn't start out that way, though. What I had happen is my mother got married at 15 years old to a fellow who was in the Air Force at 24, who was my dad. Less than a year later, they had my sister who died 2 hours after birth from spina bifida. And a year later, I was born. And my brother was born 18 months after that. We lived on an Air Force base in Wichita, Kansas. And in 1968, when he went to Vietnam for the 3rd time, a young mother of 3 really, couldn't take it anymore and moved us to the Ozark Mountains in Arkansas. And she married a guy who did not like to work. And because of that, that was the first stage, the first time in our family history that we ever lived on government subsidies. And it wasn't because he couldn't work. It's because he figured out how to manipulate the system, how to declare himself insane so he could check himself in and out, so he could use that to further get subsidies from the federal government. I lived that way from the time I was 7 years old until I left home at 17 years old. I remember the embarrassment. I was the oldest, because my mother went on to have 3 more children with him. My oldest sister with him has spina bifida. She's had it since she just turned 50 2 weeks ago. Her daughter, oldest daughter, has spina bifida. I understand what you're saying, ma'am, and it's a terrible tragedy. I've lived that life. And I've also, as I've said, I've seen the way out. And I'm not saying a lot of times just work a lot harder, But you know, what we've had the opportunity to do in this country is to provide helping hands so people can get a start in life. Till I was in 8th grade, had no running water. We lived on food stamps till the time I left home at 17. No indoor plumbing until I was in 8th grade. We moved houses. People thought my stepdad was in the military. It wasn't because of that. It's because he wouldn't pay the propane bill. He wouldn't pay the rent. He wouldn't pay for anything, and we moved from everywhere. We would drive cars and trucks that I would sit on the fender and hold a gas can because the fuel pump wouldn't work. I have seen bad stuff. And I'm also here today to tell you, I've been in Congress now for 7 months. And I came here not because I needed another job, because I want another career, it's because I wanted to make a difference. And that's what it's all about. You have to have people here who have truly experienced it, not read it in a book, not seen it on a TV show, not watched it in a movie. Some people that have actually seen what you can do in this country. It's still the greatest country in the world. It's the American dream to come to a place where you have the opportunity to be as poor as you want to be or as wealthy as you want to be. I heard a guy say one time, the bus leaves town every day. And I got on that bus and I never looked back. I'm not saying it was not ups and downs along the way, but it's been a tough road. It's not been easy. There's no doubt that people that I know today think I got everything given to me, everything. And it was never that way. And I have never taken a dime from the federal government. I'm not saying I'm proud of that, but I just said it was my mission in life to do whatever I had to do not to do that. And does that mean I'm critical of those who do? I am absolutely not. But I'm here to help people get a job, a better job, and a career. I'll tell you what I think's happened in this country is that we've kind of lost what that journey is. I worked 3 jobs. I mean, when I was young, I would go to California, we'd pick cherries, live in cherry fields and olive fields all the way through summer, come back, haul hay. You know, I got married when I was 19 years old, worked hard, got an engineering degree, worked 3 jobs in college, all this kind of stuff.
You're a minute over your time, and you've got your 5 minutes coming.
Okay, I'll get the rest of that when I come back.
Thanks. Gentleman's time has expired. I now I'll yield 5 minutes to the gentleman from New York, Mr. Morelli.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, for yet another important hearing that you're holding. And I want to thank all the witnesses for being here today and sharing your personal stories. In particular, Ms. Greer, I lost my daughter to breast cancer, so I'm particularly grateful to you for demonstrating the courage to be here and sharing your story as well. I think the testimony today shows how vital federal safety net programs are to so many people's survival throughout our country, and I would echo the comments of many of my colleagues. I'm very familiar with the critical need for many of these programs. As Rochester, New York, which I represent, has an overall poverty rate of 33.1%, with the percentage of children living in poverty sitting at 52%, the second highest in the United States. And we need to recognize that individuals and families impacted by poverty are fighting literally for their survival. From affordable housing to food insecurity, from transportation barriers to adequate child care, the challenges are overwhelming and more often than not leave far too many people trapped in a perpetual cycle of hopelessness. So I want to take just a few minutes allotted to me to discuss the need to develop an integrated system of supports for individuals and families living in poverty and crisis. And if I might quote Dr. King, aptly once said, "There's nothing new about poverty. What is new, however, is that we have the resources to get rid of it." That's what inspired some of the work we've undertaken in my district. I want to take a moment to just describe it and then ask a couple of questions. In the summer of 2017, I helped convene over 40 individuals and leaders from health, human service, and the education sectors to discuss the current state of disconnected services, the poor outcomes that result, whether a single integrated system of supports had the potential to deliver better results for people in our community. And out of that conversation, hundreds of people in our community, educators, social service providers, healthcare providers, and people impacted by poverty have created the Systems Integration Project. And it recognizes the impact of structural racism, the need for trauma-informed care, and the need for community building. And it aims to provide comprehensive connected supports that link program silos together, the fragmentation that we often see. And we hope to move people from crisis to self-sufficiency. So I do want to talk about the way we deliver services, and perhaps Dr. Barber, Maybe you could just reflect and give me some thoughts about how the current fragmentation and the different silos and people needing to move from program to program and to get eligibility and continue to fill out forms and be moved around. Have you seen the impacts of that? Is that something that troubles you? Is it something that the Poor People's Campaign has thought about in terms of how better to deliver the actual services that we do have?
Well, first of all, let me just say part of the problem is, yes, we have poor people chasing here and there. We silo these issues that can't be siloed. That's what we've said. Poverty, systemic racism, systemic ecological devastation, the war economy must be seen together. But I want to also say some other concerns, and I'm like Liz, we have here. It's almost as though people are afraid to talk to poor people who will challenge the system. They would rather talk to poor people who say, everything's just fine, we just work hard. That is not true. We're not talking about working hard. Living wages. We're saying folk ought to have a living wage if they work hard. They ought to have health care. We're saying that this is not some kind of strange government handout. This is the fact that 62 million people in this country work every day without a living wage, and if it just raises to $15, you would have over $300 and some billion going into the economy. It is amazing to us as people of faith, and we sit here and look, and we're showing, this is showing the moral crisis. We never say this to business when they fail. When people fail, we want to love you and work hard, and we all got a story about poverty. When businesses fail, let's find the money. Yeah. Let's find the money to lift them up. Let's give them government welfare, corporate welfare. And instead of talking about, wow, this article just came out, a moral economy would save taxpayers billions of dollars 10 ways. If we had comprehensive immigration reform, it would save and lift people up. We could eliminate child poverty. Universal single payer health would empower this economy. Free higher education. If we invested in true voting rights, if we had Pentagon cuts, we had an end to mass incarceration, if we had investments to give people safe drinking water, job creation, living wages, climate justice. We're talking about lifting this country up, not about everybody giving a story. I could tell the story of poverty, and I say to people who say that story, just because society failed you then doesn't mean it ought to continue to fail now. It is tragic. In a society where our first constitutional duty is to establish justice and promote the general welfare, that we will allow the injustice of poverty, 43.5% of poor people are poverty and low wealth, and people here who could teach this society, and we would walk away from our constitutional values and walk away from our spiritual values that tell us that it is dangerous for a nation not to lift up the poor. I tell you that we have a deeper moral crisis, and this is why we lead this committee to go out and organize even more and more and more poor people until folk are willing to listen to the people who are hurt and beat up every day about what must be challenged and changed.
Gentleman's time has expired. I now recognize Mr. Hearn again. I didn't charge you. I won't charge you for the extra minute, but I will hold you to your 5 minutes this time.
Thank you,
Gentleman's
Mr. Chairman.
recognized.
Appreciate it. And again, I want to thank the witnesses for being here today. And I, Reverend, I agree with you 100%. We've got to listen. We've got to do more. I've gone back and studied this a lot. It's one of the reasons I ran, because again, you heard my story, and I'll abbreviate it by saying this. I had the opportunity. Kind of fluke out happened to get into McDonald's Corporation, or into a franchising program as an assistant manager. And I worked my tail off, created 3 jobs, learned how to be a computer programmer when I was in college. Was very blessed to get my first McDonald's restaurant in 1997. It's the last time I signed, that was the first time and the last time that I ever worked for anybody else other than myself. The thing that's interesting about it, as we most know, is entry-level jobs. That was not satisfying to me. I'd worked at minimum wage when I was dipping pickles at the pickle plant when I was 16 years old. The point being with this is I made it a mission in life to figure out how to get people accelerated, teach them how to work, teach them how to pay taxes, teach them how to appreciate things. And we've had a lot of folks that have come up with minimal education, making $60,000, $70,000 a year. All my average wages are way above Oklahoma's living wage. We offered insurance. People have insurance long before affordable health care. I think it's critical. I think what's happened in America, as I've looked back over the last 20 years, when you look at real wages in America, they're about the same as they were, while everything else has gone through the roof. Cars have doubled, houses have doubled. We've shipped those great paying jobs that for entry level and middle class overseas. And I think if you look, regardless if you like President Trump or not, if you look at what's happened about bringing jobs back to America, that's what it's all about. Bringing good paying jobs back to America so that folks have the ability to transition off of the helping hand into an entry-level job that quickly accelerates into a middle-class job that can quickly accelerate into a career.
You don't believe they should start with a living wage?
You know, it's according to what the person is. If it's a person that's got kids.
They're a human being. They're created by God. They shouldn't start with a living wage if they're working 40 hours a week.
If they're 16 years old living at home, that
I'm
might
talking
be
about
different.
people, if they're 16 or 18 or 19 or 20, shouldn't they have a living wage?
Sure.
A living wage.
If they're living by themselves and they're yeah, I mean, I worked my
They
tail
shouldn't
off.
have a living wage if they got 2 people in the house, but they should have a living wage if they.
Well, again, we have to look at what the numbers, you've got stats, I want to look at the facts as well. I mean, again,
I hope we can. I really want to talk to you because I believe that down in there's a heart somewhere.
Especially-
I want to get with you, brother. I want to get with you. Maybe you can say to other folk that just want to blame the poor.
No, I don't.
Especially when wages have stagnated, especially when wages have stagnated for the past 40 years.
You control your
sorry.
time, Mr. Hearn. You can do whatever with it. You can continue the
Oh,
dialogue.
no, Mr. Chairman, I appreciate it. And again, I just want to thank you for the passion in this group, because it is something we all should be concerned about. And I know everybody is. And you came in here with the statement, Reverend, that said this should be a bipartisan issue. And I agree 110% that it should be a bipartisan issue. And we should do everything that we need. We should look at the things we're doing to help folks rise out of that poverty when times are bad. We heard it from our folks on our side. And also, we also look at how we get them, because as you said, you want folks to get a job and you want them to be moving forward, because it's not just about working hard. A lot of people work really hard. There's some bad things that happen out there, some bad things that happen, and how do we take care of them? And I've seen it firsthand. I've lived it firsthand. I've seen folks, as you all know, there are people who start at McDonald's, that's had a tough life. I've listened to those. I've had folks who've had their wives killed, you know, and the list goes on and on. I've been there to help them. I don't go broadcast this, because that's what you don't do that as a person that's trying to help somebody. When you're in business. I'm here now in a different role, a role to go back and represent my district and those folks who elected me, because they heard my story time and time again and had time to proof it out. And so that's why I'm here. I want to help. Mr. Chairman, I go back my time.
Gentleman yields back. Thank you. I now recognize the gentlelady from California and the chairwoman of the Poverty Task Force in the House, Barbara Lee from California, for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Let me thank you and our ranking member for putting this very important hearing together today. And let me thank Bishop Reverend Barber. Let me thank Reverend Theo Harris. And let me thank all of you for being here today, because you are truly bearing witness on behalf of the poor and the near poor who are living on the edge in the wealthiest country in the world. Now, I want to thank you also for leading the Poor People's Campaign and calling it a national call for moral revival, because that's what it is, and for all of your moral clarity. You remind me today of another one of Dr. King's speeches, which he gave at Riverside Church when he talked about society's 3 evils, poverty, racism, and militarism, which still loom large today in our own country. Now, let me just mention a couple of things. First of all, as someone who was on food stamps and public assistance, I know just how important your presence is here today and how important your voices are. But let me tell you, when I was on public assistance, I was able to buy a house because of a government policy that allowed people on public assistance to purchase a home. I was able later to go to college, and it was because of government policies that promoted and allowed for affirmative action and the civil rights movement. I was allowed later, before coming to Congress, to establish and own a business. I had 450 employees, union worker, good paying, union wages, good paying jobs. I was able to start my own business because of government policies that allowed for that. I received the opportunities through many years of struggle by so many people and so many organizations who forced our government to the war on poverty, to establish policies that would provide those opportunities so that myself as a young African-American Black woman would have some opportunities to achieve justice and parity. Now we see all of these policies being, unfortunately, rolled back. Many of you know that I've worked with a group of non-denominational clergy members. We call it the Circle of Protection, to highlight and make recommendations on the intersection between racism and poverty. It's a document called Unity Declaration on Racism and Poverty. Mr. Chairman, I would like permission to insert this document into the record.
Without objection, so ordered.
Thank you. Because many of these recommendations incorporate many of the line items and the budget recommendations which you have presented in terms of the moral budget. We also must begin to repair the damage for the inhumane government-sanctioned institution of slavery, which continues to be manifested today in systematic and institutional racism. But your recommendations in the Poor People's Moral Budget, it puts us on a path to closing these economic and racial disparities, not only for African Americans, but for the 140 million who are poor and who are low wealth individuals. And so I thank you for putting forth a budget and a plan and a roadmap where we know we can do this. Raising the minimum wage to a living wage, universal health care, federal investments in affordable housing, lowering the cost of prescription drugs, child tax credit, all of your recommendations are recommendations which this committee should embrace. And so I wanted to ask specifically regarding one of the recommendations, the $350 billion in annual military spending, and what this would do if we were able to finally have the political will to look at the Pentagon budget, how this would begin to help us reduce poverty in America and addressing the economic inequality, which we once again see each and every day, which you all are fighting to ensure that we eliminate and end.
Representative Lee, can I say something real quick? This time is running. I hope we can get his time back that he gave up. But anyway, we first of all, we are taking 53 to nearly 60% of every discretionary dollar going toward militarism. Less than 16 cents is going toward healthcare and infrastructure, the things that will lift us out. But there's another piece we have to add to this, and I wanted to bring this as a race piece. Liz and Callie and I talk about this all the time. In this country, every state is a voter suppression state, is a high poverty state, high child poverty state, lack of health care state, low living wage state. And guess what? The people who get elected through racist voter suppression, they then turn about and pass policy that hurt mostly white people. Let that sink in this room. The people who use racialized voter suppression end up passing policy that hurt mostly white people because there are more poor whites in raw numbers, not in concentration, than there are black. We have to, and if we don't get the voting piece right, we're never going to get people in these offices that will deal with the military issues and those kinds of things. So there's a direct connection between racialized voter suppression and the poverty that concentrates in people of color's lives, but also affects, in raw numbers, more white people than people of color.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, is there a way we can get some time that our colleague gave back?
Well, he's got, if you want to go to the minute mark, you got another 30 seconds because he went over a minute.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
So we'll take it, because 53 cents of every discretionary dollar going to the military, we are having welfare programs for the rich, for the Pentagon, for the military. And so I want Callie to talk a little bit about what we could do with the money, what we're asking you all to do with the money.
So,
how about if the gentlelady's time has expired? How about if when I get my time at the end, I will let Ms. Greer answer that question.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Fine. So now I yield 5 minutes to the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Crenshaw.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for all being here. This is an important subject, and really what it comes down to is what works and what doesn't. We all have an interest in solving any kind of poverty problem, no matter how small it is. But then we have to ask the question, what works and what doesn't? 50 years ago, President Lyndon Johnson declared a war on poverty. In the last 50 years, we've spent trillions of dollars to alleviate poverty. But what's the result? Well, our poverty rate when the war on poverty started in 1966, it was about 14.7%. By 2014, it was about the same, even after spending trillions of dollars. In the last 10 years, spending on means-tested welfare programs have increased from $430 billion to $742 billion. It's almost doubled. And we can attach the size of our heart to dollar signs all we want. We can claim that anybody who argues otherwise is immoral. I think that's unfair. You can argue it, but you can't argue the fact that it hasn't worked. But actually, in the last 3 years or so, since 2014, we have seen some decrease in poverty, 12%. But what changed? What changed? It's not the increase in spending. That's been continuous. Wage growth has increased. The economy has boomed. 3.2% wage growth. By the way, the overwhelming amount of that has gone to the bottom quintile of earners. It does not go to the top. That is by the statistics. It's also more jobs than we've ever had to fill them. I would say things that don't work are policies that make it harder for the poor to survive. A carbon tax, for instance, we've been talking a lot about ecological justice. Well, what about a carbon tax? That would raise energy prices. It would raise gas prices. Look at California. Look at Germany's experiment with their own form of a Green New Deal. They haven't reduced emissions, and they've raised prices on everybody. The rich can handle that just fine. They've got no problem handling that. The poor, they cannot handle that. Overregulating housing markets, hampering development, that causes rents to rise. Just look at San Francisco, look at New York. Again, the rich don't mind, but the poor do. It hurts the poor. Occupational licensing requirements, they can be terribly hard and burdensome on the poor if you're trying to be a hairdresser or just get into cosmetology or become a plumber. It's more difficult the more regulations you have. In Texas, we just solved this. We just made it easier for anybody to get a good paying job as a plumber. We're very proud of that. Any of you agree, I wonder, that Congress should actually increase payroll taxes on everybody across the board from 12.3, 12.4% to over 14%? I doubt any of you would agree on that, because that's an increase in taxes on everybody. It takes away from everybody. And I bet you would definitely not agree that that money should then be transferred to people in retirement who are millionaires. By the way, that's Social Security 2100. That's the Democrats' plan right now. I don't think any of you would agree with that. The method in which we've been delivering welfare payments isn't working either. We've created perverse incentives and disincentives, well-intentioned through our desire to help, to trap people in these safety nets. And let me show you what I mean. For instance, in Texas, there's a single parent of 2 on welfare and SNAP programs. They will end up taking a huge cut on their benefits if they even get a minimal raise. So to flesh this out, a single mom is desperately trying to provide her children with a better life. She works really hard, she pays it off, she's offered a promotion. But that raise comes with it. It will actually make her worse off than before because she loses some of those benefits, so she has to turn it down. This is not a good policy. In Texas, this means you're actually taxing the poor at a 53% marginal tax rate. And in other states, it can be as high as 104%. So let's talk about what has worked. Brookings says, and this is a left-wing think tank, studies have shown that if you finish high school, you get a job, any job, and wait until 21 to get married and have kids, you have an overwhelming chance of getting out of poverty. 75% join the middle class, only 2% remain in poverty. Earned income tax credits. The EITC does not punish someone for earning more. It benefits continue even as you make more income. This is bipartisan. We all agree on this. This is good policy. So it incentivizes people to improve their livelihood while also maintaining that financial cushion beneath them. They don't fall off of a benefits cliff. So rather being stuck in an entry-level job, they can keep making it. We also have to be focused on addressing the skills gap. All right, that's a huge part. We talk about building more capital for the poor. Education is a big part of that. Why don't we look at changing the Pell Grant program? I bet a lot of you would say that it's not always realistic for somebody to get a 4-year degree. Spend that 4 years. Maybe they have a family to feed. Why don't we make Pell Grants available for skills or for trades, shorter term duration training? God, I wish I had more time to ask you all questions because I do have a lot. But Ms. Fields, I want to end with this.
Please, because you haven't. Please read
Ms. Fields, I want to end with this.
Please read it.
When you teach your kids, do you?
Please read it.
Do you teach them, Mr. Chairman, if you will indulge me this one question, or it's up. Oh, okay. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. When you said you homeschooled your kids, and I want to understand what values you teach them. Do you teach them to be responsible for themselves? Do you teach them that their actions matter, or do you teach them that the system is working against them? Do you teach them that no matter what they do, they can't thrive? I mean, what would you teach somebody if you love them?
Oh, I definitely teach them personal responsibility. And even to add to that, what you were saying about trade, me and my husband both, even though I have a bachelor's degree, I also have a trade. My husband is a barber. He has a trade. We have lived the life they're saying with the living wages. I bought a house making $4.25 an hour. So we understand living on wages, but the way we got out of poverty is what you're saying, is we got trade. We went and got an education. And my husband talk about that all the time. If the government could make trade more accessible, spend those federal dollars so people can sharpen their skills and get out. My husband just bought us a 3-bedroom home, 2 full bath home in Chicago, being a barber with a trade. He has a 10th grade education, and he did it with a trade skill. So those are the kind of programs that we should be advocating for our government to sharpen our skills, bring back those trade skills into the Black community so that we can rise above poverty. We can't do it with just a high school education all the time. We need trade, we need skills.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And
Gentleman's time is.
It was a good conversation about
Gentleman's time has expired.
Thank
Reverend Barber, I'm sorry. Now yield 5 minutes to the gentleman from Nevada, Mr. Horsford.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. This is a very important hearing today. I want to thank Reverend Dr. William Barber II, as well as Reverend Dr. Theo Harris. It's good to see you. I know your brother. He does work with my wife, who's a professor at Columbia. But thank you for being here today and for talking about the Poor People's Campaign and your vision for how we strengthen children, families, and communities, which is at the core of what this hearing is really all about. Thank you to my esteemed colleague, Congresswoman Barbara Lee, the chair of the Poverty Congressional Caucus, for highlighting this issue, not just today, but for many years prior to today's hearing. Now, I want to get right to it. Since I was sworn in on January 3rd of this year, the Trump administration and my colleagues on the other side have attacked nearly every safety net program from every angle that they can think of. This after passing the jobs and tax cut scam of the last Congress that provided 83% of the benefits to the top 1% wage earners and biggest corporations in this country. And now on the backs of those individuals, because their tax cut adds to our federal deficit, they have proposed cutting SNAP by $220 billion, cutting Social Security by $84 billion and other disability programs, cutting $1.5 trillion from Medicaid over 10 years, and a 10% across-the-board cut to TANF block grant. This administration's most recent attack on safety net programs came by way of a proposed rule through the U.S. Office of Management and Budget that would change the way the federal government measures poverty, which has not been very well publicized because this administration does not want to bring attention to the fact that they are balancing their tax cut on the backs of poor people.
Wow.
The chairman and I sent a letter to the acting OMB director expressing our deep concerns about this rulemaking change. And Mr. Chairman, I'd like to enter that letter into the record.
Without objection.
I'd also like to enter an article, Black Poverty is Rooted in Real Estate Exploitation, into the record.
Without objection.
The proposed rule would inevitably lower the income eligibility limits for safety net programs that are tied to the poverty line and will impose unfathomable hardships on families. The proposal would disproportionately affect many constituents in my home state of Nevada, including 425,000 Nevadans that receive SNAP benefits, 633,000 Nevadans that are enrolled in Medicaid and SCHIP, and 3,000 children that are eligible for Head Start and early Head Start programs that I can't get in because they want to cut the budget. I have young people and their families that are on a waiting list. You talk about investing in education, talk about investing in career and technical education, their budget cuts the very programs that you propose to invest in. And it's personal because it comes to the children, our families, and the communities. I come from a poor community. I grew up in a poor community raised by a single parent. I lost my father to gun violence when I was 19. But for the support of programs like this, I would not be sitting here as a member of Congress. So I have an obligation, like my colleagues who are trying to bring attention to this issue, to the priorities and the values of our budget, as the speaker said. Ms. Kenzie and Alqass, I listened to your deeply personal testimonies. Can you explain to us what you would have done had you been kicked off of these safety net programs? How would you have been able to survive?
As an undocumented person, first of all, most of us don't have access to any of these programs. Just want to make that clear. The reason in the way that our community is coping through making survival methods. I mean, we literally have to organize ourselves in a way that we are protecting our community and protecting ourselves. And like I said before, in Unión de Vecinos, there's times where our government even tells us that they don't have money to cover potholes. What our community is doing, they fundraise for cement and cover our own potholes. There are times where we are told that there's no lighting for our alleys, and what we are doing is that we are go to Home Depot and buy the solar panels with lighting and install them ourselves. These are the things that our community has to resource to because there is a lack of will within our government to resolve issues that are very basic. The fact that we have to go to our community members when there's someone in need and say, hey, do you have a tomato? Do you have a potato? Do you have some chicken so we can put a basket together for this family that it's in need? It's something that we have to resource to. And it's true, there are churches that do lend a helping hand. There are churches that are giving food out on Sundays because they understand that there's a need for hunger in their communities, but they also understand that they need to push the government to do more.
Thank you. It's a partnership.
Exactly.
And we have to work together
Thank
to
you.
meet the needs of our people.
Gentleman's
Thank you,
time
Mr.
has
Chairman.
expired. I now recognize the gentle lady from Washington, Ms. Jayapal, for 5 minutes.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to my friend Barbara Lee for her unwavering leadership on lifting up poverty across this country and the urgency of now, the urgency of addressing this issue now. But most of all, I am grateful to you from the Poor People's Campaign who are here bringing the people's voice to the people's house. I'm grateful for your courage and for your moral clarity, which came through so clearly in every one of your testimonies. And your organizing reminds us that poverty is not inevitable. It is caused by human-created structures and immoral policies. You remind us that we can lift up a whole society to create community prosperity. And you remind us that we can and we must have health care for all people. You remind us that no human being is illegal. You remind us that mass incarceration is dangerous, racist, and completely avoidable. That war and a giant military budget are moral outrages. And that most importantly, you remind us that those most directly affected by poverty and oppression are actually the ones best equipped to lead us forward. As your People's Moral Budget report so eloquently states, poverty is a willful act of policy violence that leaves over 43% of the population poor or low income. So thank you for being here today with us, and thank you for your clarity and your courage. Let me start with you, Ms. Greer. I could not listen to your story without feeling the same tears that you were feeling. Nothing like what you were feeling, but feeling some piece of that. That painful story of the loss of your daughter, what you had to go through, and you said something very powerful. You said, we shouldn't have to ask for this. We shouldn't have to ask for health care. It is a right. Hearing your personal story about the immense suffering of your family and so many other families across the country that are experiencing not having health insurance, this basic right of health insurance. As you may know, I've introduced a Medicare for All bill for universal health care because I believe this is a human right. But one of the things that I am confronted with critics constantly is people who say that this would be too expensive, that the United States can't do universal health care because it would be too expensive. Can you give me guidance on how you would respond to that and what you want me to say every time I hear that?
I would say to you The federal cost for expanding Medicaid in 14 states will be about $25 billion in the first year. That's about the same amount the Pentagon hands over to Boeing every year. Okay, one more time.
That's right.
The federal cost for expanding Medicaid in 14, not one, in 14 states would be about $25 billion in the first year. That's about the same amount that the Pentagon hands over to Boeing every year.
Thank you. Thank you for that. And you've transitioned me to my next question. I have questions for every one of you, but I'm not going to have time. But my next question is for Mr. Overfelt. I have been trying to take on with some of my colleagues the outrageous amounts of money spent on military defense. And it seems like this increasing spending on war and military defense is often seen as something you cannot even challenge, and that if you challenge it, you are somehow unpatriotic. Mr. Overfelt, you are a patriot, a true patriot, who has actually put your life on the line and served in the military yourself. Many of the people who advocate for increased defense spending have not done that. So can you tell me how we should respond to the charge that it is somehow unpatriotic to try to cut our spending on military defense and endless wars in order to have a better world, but yes, also to transfer some of those funds to the things that we really need to have a safe and secure nation and world?
Well, I flew in here from Kansas City, and when I flew in, I could see the Pentagon out the window, and then I saw right next to the Pentagon, I saw a building with the name Boeing on it. And right next to that, I saw a building with the name Lockheed Martin on it. These entities go hand in glove. The Pentagon acts as a siphon towards military contractors, a siphon of taxpayer money that could be used to help us in our communities. I want to say that when we talk about American foreign policy, we need to understand the context in which it operates, which is the flow of resources from the southern hemisphere to the northern hemisphere. That is not to keep us safe. That is in the national interests of corporations, of transnational corporations, and to ensure their profits. So we are spending taxpayer money to subsidize transnational corporations, not to keep the American people safe.
Thank you. And Mr. Chairman, just quickly before I yield back, let me say Boeing is in my state. And it used to be the kind of company that actually supported living wage jobs, unionization, good working class jobs. That is not the case today. And I thank you for raising that up. And let us just imagine a world where we could have corporations who understand that they can only be successful if they're lifting up the communities and the people that make up those corporations, that make up those communities. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you. Gentlelady's time has expired. Now I recognize the gentleman from New Jersey, Mr. Series, for 5 minutes.
Well, good afternoon, and thank you for being here. I made sure I stayed here to listen to every one of you before I had to go to my office. Let me give you a little bit about my background. I represent the northern part of New Jersey. I represent cities like Jersey City, portions of Newark. I represent the town of West New York that I live in. And just to give you an idea that is so urban, it's 1 square mile and we have 53,000 people. 93% of the student body in that town is Hispanic. So that tells you that it's not a wealthy district. We depend. I'm a former mayor of that town. As a mayor, I depended on federally funded clinics to be able to help these people. If we didn't have that, I don't know what we would have done. Even just to get the shots so they could attend to school. That federally funded clinic was very, very important. That's not to mention all the other diabetes, which in minorities is a big, big problem. So federally funded clinics and federally funded programs, I think, are extremely important to help people get out of poverty. I just visited a housing complex on Friday in Newark, New Jersey. I mean, It's just incredible, some of these conditions that people are living in. They're trying to do something about it. And we have a lot of problems with these formulas. You know, this poverty formula goes back 40 years and only a little bit for inflation. But there's also a great area that you can help people. They seem to fall off that formula to assist the people. And not to mention, the amount of veterans that we are getting that have no place to live, no housing for veterans. After World War II, there was an effort to help the veterans. I am hopeful that in the future we can have the same kind of program so we can help veterans. So when you talk about poverty, you know, I live it. I grew up in that town. I came to this country when I was 11 years old. My father and mother had a 4th and 5th grade education. But some of these programs are just necessary for people to take on the next step.
Mm-hmm.
Housing, affordable housing, low-income housing, I think is a priority. And I just want from you to tell me which of those programs you think is the best to improve so we can get some decent housing for some of these people.
So, I mean, there are quite a few programs that we need. I mean, we need rent subsidies. We need to build more public housing. We need to stop the criminalization of people who are homeless. So I think how we take these issues in the campaign is that we see them all connected. That we need to raise wages, because that's a housing issue. We need to ensure medical care, because that's a housing issue. We need to fund education and health for our veterans, because that's a housing issue. That we need to build up Head Start, because that's a housing issue. All of these programs that you all have power to fund. We need, when people talk about the question of wages and then losing your eligibility for some of these programs, we need to raise eligibility and raise wages. We should not be talking about lowering eligibility of poverty programs, of housing programs. We shouldn't be talking about attaching work requirements to housing programs, to food programs.
You know, talk about Head Start. One of the most successful programs that I saw is when we contracted with Head Start to take care of the children after they get out of school, what they call their wraparound program, because that gave the ability of the parents to go and get a job and work and know that their children were being taken care of. So those are the kind of programs that I think would help.
And Head Start has this piece on the maximum feasible participation of people who are poor. It's a community jobs program. It's a community health program. It's a interlocking program. But Kenya had something to say.
But housing.
Poor People's Campaign, out of the first Poor People's Campaign program, it's because preachers and everyday people came to this body because they heard what the Lord said about the homeless and housing. That is a part of the Poor People's Campaign. Yes, sir.
Very, very briefly, please.
Well, one of the things that I want to say, it's public housing is very important. People living in public housing are
Decent public housing.
Decent public housing are only paying 30% of their income into homes. People who are paying market rate rent today are paying 60 to 70% of their income into housing.
Absolutely.
That means that sometimes we have to stay up at night figuring out what bill we pay, if we can buy milk for our children, and if we are going to be able to pay our rent. That's what we need. We need to be able to pay only 30% of our income into housing.
Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you, gentlemen. Time has expired. Now I recognize Mr. Stewart for 5 minutes.
Thank Chairman and Ranking Member, and apologize to you and other members and the witnesses for not being able to be here earlier. Other hearings and some I had to chair, and I just wish I could. I understand it's been a very interesting hearing. I don't know that I've been to a hearing where we've had quite so many witnesses. I hope y'all have had a chance to express your views. And I want you to know that I think we have common goals. I don't think there's anyone in this room who doesn't have a desire to lift people up, to help them live productive lives, to help them feel like the government wants to make their lives easier if possible and not harder. I think the concern I have is sometimes some people think government is the answer. Sometimes they think it's the only answer. And we know that there are other pieces to this puzzle, and I'd like to spend a few minutes talking about some of those if we could. Again, recognizing government is not the only source of anti-poverty spending. I love these statistics, some of these facts. America is the most generous nation I think the world has ever seen. And we should be proud of that. We should recognize that. $410 billion in 2017 Americans gave to charitable organizations. There's not another country that comes even close to that. In some of my writing, I've had a chance to analyze that. We are a very generous people. Interestingly, more than a 5% increase from the previous year. So we're not becoming less generous. In many ways, we're becoming more generous. And I'm grateful for those people who participate in ways like that. Anti-poverty programs, they don't just rely on government funding, and we're grateful for that, for these other people that are generous. Being from Utah, most of you don't know that, it's not something you would know, but I'm from Salt Lake City is my district, a beautiful city, and it's obviously the headquarters for the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, and they're a great example, I think, of an organization that is involved in trying to lift people up and to help them. They're not the only example. There's many other faith-based organizations. There's hundreds or thousands of them who also do great work. The Church of Jesus Christ, I think, is a good example of it, though. They work in employment services. They work in food assistance, the Bishop's Warehouse, partnering with other organizations. I've been to the food pantries and seen the great work they do there, not just in Utah, by the way, but throughout the country and frankly, throughout the world. Family services, free courses in education and finding a better job. I mean, the list goes on. Pastor Mahan, I guess I would ask you, in your background there, in your experience, how important are these community and faith-based organizations in helping combat poverty and to helping do as we all want to do, and that's lift people and help better their lives?
You have to engage them. Thank you, sir. You have to engage them because anybody in this room that has been a part of a program, government program, whether it's a government school, whether it's a government housing program, whether it's a government food program, we've been disingenuous if we lift those programs up like they're blessings all the time. There's a lot of churches that don't want to be involved in government stuff just because it smells like government. It's like, we're just gonna throw money at this thing regardless of the values just being, you know, you guys said that there's values behind budgets, but there's also values behind programs. And a lot of times they don't want to engage because of the values that come behind the money. It's like a Trojan horse. Yes, we're gonna bless you with money and housing, but yet we're going to give you all of these values that are against what we believe and how we raise our families. And so you have to engage the churches and really all faith communities. You have to engage them on how to reach their own people. I think would be a huge step forward.
And I'm going to dive down on that just a little bit. A lot of times we talk about money, and you obviously can't do much without financial resources. It makes it very, very difficult not to have, you know, as I said, the resources to fund some of these things. But there's another element to that, and that's the volunteers. It's people who are willing to, hey, I'll be a big brother. Hey, I'll work at the homeless kitchen. Talk a little bit about that, would you, Pastor, and how important are volunteers to your community and the service you're trying to provide?
Yeah, in our community, the mayor just gathered all the churches together. It's 20-some pastors. And he said, if anything goes wrong in this city, everybody knows that it's going to be you all that does the brunt of the work of fixing and getting people out of this crisis. And so, yeah, the church is critical in putting their hands to the plow, training the churches to get engaged with the schools, training the churches to get engaged at the governmental levels, the school board levels. These are critical pieces because, again, they don't know about what's going on in this room. All they know is that, look, we care about people, but we're not going to care about people and sacrifice our values because the government says that we need to because we won't get the money.
And that's a fair thing to expect. It would be unfair for someone to be compelled to do something that they don't believe just to have government assistance. We could go on, but Chairman, my time is out. Thank you.
Thank you. Gentleman's time has expired. I now recognize the gentleman from California, Mr. Panetta, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Womack, and of course, all of the witnesses for being here, as well as your preparation to be here. Thank you very much for your time, as well as your expertise on these topics. I'm sure there have been a number of questions asked that deal with a number of areas that I wanted to talk about, but I'm just going to kind of narrow it down. And if I'm limited in that sense, that's fine. And if you've talked about this, I apologize. But I want to talk about affordable housing and how that affects people put in situations and into poverty. And in my district on the Central Coast of California, especially when it comes to renters, what you're going to see is about 29% of all renters, it's about 31,000 households, are severely cost burdened, as it's called. Basically, then what that means is that they're paying more than 50% of their income to housing costs and utilities. And so I was wondering if any of you could speak about the high cost of housing and how that drains the pockets of low-income families and how that contributes to homelessness. And go ahead and if Drs. Barber and Theo Harris could maybe talk about it.
Start.
Please.
Just to let you know, I work in the city of Los Angeles. I am with Unión de Vecinos, which is a tenant advocacy organization. We're with the LA Tenants Union. And part of my job and my work every day is to go into the office and see people that are going through eviction processes. Not just in the city of LA, I have folks coming from Long Beach, from Orange County, from San Bernardino, from different parts. And the issue of housing, it's very, very ingrained in the fact that there is no safety net when it comes to housing, unless you are in public housing, or because even Section 8 you can lose, right? So one of the things that I think it's very important is that we have to talk about rent control. There needs to be a cap on these rental markets. We need to make sure that we're doing something about it. And communities have been organizing, but the reality is that all of these corporations and all of these landowners and homeowners lied. We tried passing Prop 10 last year. That would have allowed us to have a statewide rent control. That would have allowed communities to feel safe. In Boyle Heights, our community is being gentrified. There's high investment that is coming into our community, but it's not for our community. Our community is driven out of Boyle Heights into San Bernardino County, where we have seen that it's an underdeveloped county. So part of the work that we need to do is to make sure that when we're investing in the actual community that lives in that community and not pushing those communities out.
We have to have an increase in investment in infrastructure in impoverished communities. But we always have to connect. It's interlocking injustices. Yeah. There's not one county in the United States where working at a minimum wage job, 40 hours a week, that you can afford a basic 2-bedroom apartment. In most places, you have to work plus 80 hours. And from a moral perspective, a Christian perspective, poverty, housing, treating immigrants right, are the values of faith. They are the values. I'm a pastor. I didn't want to talk like this, but since I'm a pastor, I've been a pastor over 30 years. I have 500 years of ministry in my family as pastor. Our church has built homes for low, moderate income people. We house senior citizens. We have programs for the poor. But pastors also must be prophets, like Jesus was, and challenge the system. And all the homes we've built has nothing to do with people not getting a living wage. That's a government policy. And I just want to say it to this committee again and to the people here. Slavery was a government policy. The lack of civil rights was a government policy. The lack of living wages is a government policy. The lack of housing is a government policy. So to say government is bad is ridiculous. We are here in the government. What the problem is when you have a government that pushes for the few and caters to Wall Street and caters to the greedy and does not care for we, the people. And to suggest that 43.5 million people 43% of this country, 140 million people, I'm gonna keep saying like a broken record, that if they just loved and got charity from the church when the government created the poverty, then you're gonna ask the church to fix the poverty? No. The church should be challenging the government, just like we challenge the government over slavery, just like we challenge the government over the lack of women's right to vote, just like we challenge the government over civil rights. We should be prophetic and challenge for a policy shift that could lift people. And to not do that is at best theological malpractice, at worst is heresy.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Gentleman's time has expired. Now recognize the gentlelady from Minnesota, Ms. Omar, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman, and thank you, Congresswoman Barber Lee, for your championship in championing this particular issue. I'm a little frustrated because I heard a lot about love, and one thing that I know is it's not because of the lack of love that we're not able to feed our children. It's not because of the lack of love that we are able to house people. It's not the lack of love that we are unable to save people from dying because they don't have health care. It's not because of lack of love that you were able to finish college because you got help with childcare. Love has nothing to do with this. And if you want to bring love into this, you got to bring radical love. Because radical love means that we radically love every single person within our communities to make sure that we are providing for them the basic rights as humans. That's what love is. And that's the godly thing to do. So if we want to talk about faith, we also have to remember that we can't pray our problems away.
Exactly.
You can't pray for your children to be fed, so you're not crying because they're crying and they can't go to bed. You cannot pray for your medical bills to disappear. You cannot pray for the mold to stop poisoning your children in the classrooms. The other thing that frustrates me is people who have experienced poverty, who have gotten the straps for their bootstraps, who sit and talk about how we shouldn't do anything for the next person. See, as someone who knows severe poverty, I lived in a refugee camp, on the floor, no water, nothing. And I hear somebody say, here in the United States, they're fine with their grandparents not having running water? And that's supposed to be okay? Or we hear someone say, it was a choice made up to me to have my children and not be like the other black people who get to have children out of wedlock. We don't get to have those kind of conversations. The conversations we get to have is how we are responsible for fully funding our schools so all of our children have the opportunities we have as we sit in this room. We get to talk about the kind of opportunities we have as government to make sure health care is provided to everybody so that we don't have people dying in the United States because they can't afford insulin. The conversation we get to have is making sure that there are no children going to sleep hungry or being shamed in classrooms and in lunchrooms because their families don't have enough money to pay for their lunch. The conversation we get to have about the kind of poverty we have in this country is the kind of poverty that says it is okay for us to take photo pictures with veterans and be okay with the fact that they're sleeping on the streets here in the United States. So as an immigrant, as someone who came to this country, hearing about American exceptionalism and prosperity, I am appalled that we get to sit here and have conversations as Americans about being the most charitable country in the world and not being charitable enough to house our homeless, feed our children, care for our veterans. What is charitable about that? So I ask you, the kind of systematic barriers that exist in prosperity, that's the conversation we should be having. And so I want you guys to, for the little bit of time that I have, to talk about the systematic barriers that exist in creating prosperity and what it means for us to remove those so that all of us could have the prosperity that is guaranteed within our Constitution.
Since the gentlelady's time has basically expired, why don't you address it to one person
Yes.
and then let that person respond?
I was going to yield to Savannah, but Savannah, I'll tell you what to do. I want you to hold my hand. Because we came here to have a real conversation. We didn't come here to talk this mythology and foolishness about, I grew up in poverty and therefore I just worked hard and got. That's not what we came here to talk about. We have a budget. If you got your budget, hold it up, Liz. I want the nation. I'm gonna speak to America now. I want to see the front of it. Where your treasure is, that's where your heart is. You can talk all day long about love and heart. Where your treasure is, where your heart is. And justice requires not just praying and going to church, but it requires justice. Jesus said that people who engage in religiosity but do not care for justice, he called that hypocrisy. So let's talk about investment. Let's talk about barrier. Love in a democracy would be investing in democracy and equal protection under the law. That's what's in here. It would be investing in domestic tranquility, investing in an equitable economy, fair taxes, raised income. It would be investing in life and health care and full health care for everybody, and equal treatment. It would be investing in our future, investing in early learning, child care, health care, K through 12, higher education, inclusion for all undocumented youth, and HBCUs investment, tribal school investment. Love would be investing in the planet, access to clean water and sanitation, addressing climate change through clean energy. Real love and justice would be investments in peace and common defense, ending the culture of war, reducing military spending, ending militarism at home, eliminating militarism and immigration, eliminating militarism and policing and mass incarceration, and ending easy access to firearms. We came here with a plan, not just with partisan mythology. We came here with a plan to challenge both Democrats and Republicans, but it seems like one side we really got to challenge, but we're gonna work on everybody because we need a plan because the 43.5% and 140 million people, their backs are against the wall and they are dying at a rate of 250,000 per year.
Thank you, Reverend Barber. We are going to get the radical love that Jesus preached, so thank you.
I think the gentlelady's time has expired, and as we mentioned earlier in the hearing, at the beginning of the hearing, that your budget and plan is as part of the formal record. Under normal circumstances, the ranking member and I would now have 10 minutes each to use as we saw fit. We're about to have votes called on the floor, so the ranking member and I have just agreed to spend just a small portion of our time closing the hearing. So I recognize the ranking member.
I thank the chairman, and it's been a long hearing, and we've heard a lot, and we've learned a lot. I think the common thing that we've learned is that we have a poverty issue in our country. We've had a poverty issue for a long time. We've done a lot of things, spent a lot of money trying to address poverty issues. The challenge for the Congress, which is the, I guess, the final arbiter of these issues, is to figure out how much we have to spend, what programs are most meaningful and beneficial to arrive at the outcomes that can address the root causes of the problem, and allocate those resources accordingly in a way that, with proper oversight, that we can get the very best return on that investment that we can. That is what the taxpayers of our country ask of us, is to make sure, as the people who hold the purse strings, to ensure that the money that's going out is being spent in a wise and productive fashion. There's not a person on this dais that does not want to see every single person in this country lifted out of poverty, to become productive in their lives, to make really, really good personal decisions, to really live that American dream. But there are a lot of different opinions as to exactly how we approach that. I liked what my colleague Bill Johnson said at the very beginning about the importance of the father in the household. And we've got too many single-parent households these days. We can't legislate that, but we can have it as a goal for this country to improve the family circumstance in such a way that we can help our young people get that education, make those decisions that break, if you will, that cycle of poverty. And that's what I hope to see out of this. Now, there have been some references made out of defense spending today. And as you heard in my opening remarks, I am a 30-year veteran with a deployment under my belt in support of the national security of this country. And I am a strong advocate for the men and women who, on a voluntary basis, put their hand up and say they'll go anywhere, anytime, under any circumstance, and fight for something greater than themselves. It was mentioned by one gentleman on the panel today that when you fly into Washington, you fly over the Pentagon, and then you fly over names of major defense contractors. Let me also remind you that you fly over Arlington National Cemetery. And those headstones that I see out there and those crosses represent something to me. And the way that we can continue to honor the commitment and the sacrifice and the hardship suffered by well over 1 million people who've died in defense of their country, the way we honor them is to make sure that we protect the principles espoused in the founding of this country throughout the rest of history, so we can give the rest of society an opportunity to pursue the American dream that has been given as hope for all of us. So with that said, Mr. Chairman, I don't have any questions for the panel. I know we're about to head to the floor for votes, and I want to thank everybody for coming today and telling your personal stories, and I will yield back the balance of my time.
I thank the gentleman, and I yield myself time for my closing remarks. You know, I agree with the ranking member that without question, the goal of this government should be to lift as many people out of poverty as possible. It is not to support as many poor people as possible. That should be our objective. But reality is that we live in a different world, and I empathize with all the stories that we've heard today from some of my colleagues about their background and how they came up in poverty. We're in a very different world from when those gentlemen were describing their upbringing. And it's going to get even tougher in this world. The technology revolution that we're seeing now, that we're going to continue to see, is going to disrupt far more lives than anything we've ever experienced in this country. And we're going to be in for a rough stretch. And it's not just going to be poorly educated or lesser educated people. It's going to be CPAs and radiologists and a lot of people who spend a lot of money getting an education and we're working for high wages, and their jobs are going to be drastically changed as well. So I'm very conscious of what we need to do as a country. I don't have the answers, but I know what we're going to have to cope with. And we're going to have to make sure that everybody in this country is supported to the extent that they can be productive as possible. I don't think there's any greater need in this country right now for our long-term prospects than early childhood education. Because if we don't make sure that the next generation of Americans, that younger generation of Americans, has the opportunity and the resources to be productive citizens, then we're arguing over nothing now, because there won't be a tax base for us to argue about how to spend. We won't have people, when the baby boomers retire and pass on, and I'm one of those, and then the next generation, if we don't make sure that the youngest generation and the generation after that are productive citizens, where's the tax base going to be? And I've said this to a lot of white people I've had arguments with. If we don't make sure non-white Americans make a lot of money and pay a lot of taxes, then white America's not going to retire, not going to be able to retire, because there won't be any resources. So this is not a simple issue. Just like everything else we deal with on the federal level, it is really complicated. Poverty is not an easy issue. the fact remains we have the greatest disparity between the wealthiest Americans and everybody else that we've ever had, in the last 100 or so years. And we have greater disparity in wealth and income in this country as most any other industrialized nation. And I look at things like the Earned Income Tax Credit. Great program, has lifted a lot of people out of poverty and supported a lot of people. And Democrats love it, and some Republicans love it, but you know who loves it more than anybody? Corporate America. Corporate America loves it because it helps them, it allows them to pay lower salaries, and because the EITC is supporting their workers. And that's the same thing with Medicaid in a lot of cases, and it's the same thing with SNAP. These are all, to a certain extent, subsidies to corporate America. I once had a conversation, it was my first election, with a McDonald's franchisee, and we were arguing about raising the minimum wage. Then it was $5.25, and he said what a difficult imposition that would be on him if he had to raise the if we raised the minimum wage on him. And I said, you know, what would you say if I came to you and I said, you know, I've got the greatest business concept that ever came down the pike, and it's just absolutely foolproof. The only catch is that I have to have people working for me for nothing. What would you say? He said, I'd say you're insane. I said, in today's world, that was 2006, I said, in today's world, what's the difference between $5 an hour and nothing? Not much. And still, here we are, 13 years later, and we're at $7.25. Now, the reality is, I understand not many people are making $7.25, but there are a lot of people out there making $9 and $10, and $9 and $10 are not living wages either. And you all know that extremely well. So there is a lot of institutionalized, issues that we have to deal with as a country. Congress can't deal with all of them. But the fact remains that we have an obligation. I always say government's the way we organize our responsibilities to each other. And one of those responsibilities is to understand that we have a capitalistic system that ends up with winners and losers, and the losers are not necessarily losers because they didn't try hard, because they weren't talented. They were losers because there are naturally winners and losers in society. And it's the government's obligation to make sure we do everything we can to make sure they have a decent standard of living, and then give them the support to rise out of poverty and become winners at all levels. So with that, I would say we've got a lot of work to do. The Poor People's Campaign has done a lot of work and has a lot of work to do, and I want to thank everybody here for focusing on a very, very important national issue. Thank you for your time, your passion, and most of all, bringing your experience to the committee and this Congress. And with that, with no further business, the committee is adjourned.
We learned something.
This ain't where we put the narrative. That's how I